you. Now they can. So you're good. And yes, just go ahead and continue on with that.
Okay.
Yeah, just go ahead.
And back, in the earlier part of the past century, there was a Great Depression, and people were thinking about survival, not so much worried about the environment. And also, following that was rapid industrialization. And that's where the pollution started to increase considerably. The first version of the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1948. But there were a lot of reasons why it wasn't extremely effective. And then in 1965, the Water Quality Act strengthened that, and ultimately we by 1972 got the Federal Water Pollution Control Act and amendments, and that is the Clean Water Act.
Okay, I'm gonna just do one more thing because we want to share your screen. That's better. Just getting used to the technical stuff here. We'll be good. Okay, now the folks who are watching are seeing your presentation, and we'll just do right now. There, is that it? Is that your slide?
Yes,
Good.
and can I use the buttons to advance?
Let's see. Yes, page down, page up, right there.
Thank you. So the Clearwater had a very significant role in the enactment of the Clean Water Act. At that time, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had passed and had been published in the New Yorker in 1962. And in 1969, the Clearwater was launched by the Hudson River Sloop Restoration, which was incorporated in 1966. And the crew and the volunteers sailed up and down the river collecting signatures on petitions. And I've maintained that tradition for the last 22 years that I've been here. And in fact, we have a couple petitions out on the table for you to sign. And in 1970, the Environmental Protection Act was created by Richard Nixon. And also in 1970, he and the Clearwater crew sailed to Washington, D.C. for the very first Earth Day. And let's see. Okay. So the picture on the left is a little bit later, but one of the major issues Clearwater has worked on related to the Clean Water Act is the fact that General Electric discharged PCBs into the Hudson River. And that's a picture of Pete singing in protest and making people aware of that with the children in the foreground. And this is some of the early history that I wasn't as clear on, but in the upper left, that's Pete at a sign that says, "Swim at your own risk." And in the center is some of the early Clearwater staff and volunteers. The FOM, a barge that was grounded on a rock in the Hudson, spilled 420,000 gallons of heavy oil and that affected the waterfowl, and they then came out and suited up and captured them and cleaned them and moved them to safety. And in the upper right is John Cronin taking a sample for a very famous, the first case in New York State under the Clean Water Act was tape at Poughkeepsie, and then on the lower left is Andra Thromick giving testimony about fish impingement. When Indian Point opened, the fish were impinged on screens and killed, and she's describing that a little bit later. And there is a picture of John and Andra out on the river taking a sample from the ExxonMobil discharge into the Hudson River, which they were saying was just filter water, but the sample showed it was filled with polluting chemicals. And a picture about tape, and then on the upper left is a thank you note from Pete to John saying the price of liberty is eternal publicity. And I'll tell you, for that, what's been going on for the last few days, I'll vouch for that. And then on the lower right is Jeff Edwards, a Clearwater youth specialist who is pulling a shopping cart out of the river. The goals of the Clean Water Act are fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. And in particular, the 1972 legislation declared as its objective the restoration, maintenance of chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And a lot of this information is on the handouts that you were given. So I'm going to move forward so that we can get to the main speakers. But some of the main accomplishments were that it was unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters. Somewhat better protection for wetlands, but I think they have a long way to go there. Point source pollution was controlled, but not non-point source. And sewage treatment plants were funded. And there are now approximately 16,000 wastewater treatment plants or publicly owned treatment works. And then Clearwater has spent years now first getting EPA to get GE to clean up the river, and now working on the PCV cleanup. And there's two distinct phases. One is the upper Hudson, and that's where the remediation took place. There's now a 5-year review underway. And then the overall restoration to provide healthful habitat for wildlife is under the purview of the Natural Resource Damage Trustees. And that's ongoing. They've published various different studies. Also, for the Upper Hudson, we have a settlement agreement for remediation. We have a settlement agreement to look at the Lower Hudson, to do GE has to do a study of the Lower Hudson. And right here in Newburgh, where PFOS has contaminated their water supply up in Washington, we have a restoration advisory board. So things we have made and are making progress, but there are ongoing challenges, which include non-point source pollution, a persistent legacy of PCBs and lead and others, and you'll be hearing more about these. The wastewater treatment facilities are aging. There are still many combined sewer overflows that allow raw sewage to get out into the river. Invasives, including the zebra mussel around Gobi and various plants, including the Asian water chestnut, and emerging contaminants, PFOS. We will hear more about that. They're not just here in Newburgh, they're also present throughout Rockland County and Hoosick Falls and many other places. Microplastics, sea level rise, and I think that's especially concerning because brownfields that have been protected could be compromised, and radioactive discharges, which we've been hearing a lot about and really want to try to prevent from Indian Point. And I'm sure there are many other things that, many other challenges. There is some good legislation that has passed recently or pending, and that includes the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, the Green Amendment to the New York State Constitution, which needs to be flushed out, the Environmental Bond Act, which can be used to solve some of these problems. There's a rights of river percolating up and down the river. Ulster County is considering that legislation, especially as it relates to the Green Amendment. And the news of the day, the month, the year is Haltech's plan to discharge up to 1 million gallons of radioactive water from the fuel holes into the Hudson, and we're trying to stop that. And there is a piece of legislation sponsored by Pete Harcum and Dana Levenberg that would prevent discharge of radioactive material into all of New York's waterways. And I think with that, I am done my introduction, and I would like to welcome
Hold on, I'm gonna. Okay.
Do that.
Don't leave that up too long.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. It's not that early. So what I want to talk about today is I'm going to talk about a little bit about the current status of the Clean Water Act and the future of it. But to talk about the future, we have to talk about the past a little bit more, which I will do also. I'll tell you the reason I have this image up here is I grew up in Yonkers, and we were blessed in Yonkers to have this view looking across the river. And luckily for the folks across the river, because of that geology, they didn't have to look at, nobody had to look at us in Yonkers. But when I was a kid, my father used to take us to this place called The Ridge, which was a high point in Yonkers, which looked out over the factories where all my family worked and over the river to the other side. And when I was a kid, the only purpose I knew for the Hudson River was actually to separate us from New Jersey. Now, the folks in New Jersey thought the same thing. So if anybody here was raised in New Jersey, don't be offended. But for us, that's what it was there. It was a moat to protect us from each other. And we knew nothing about the Hudson, other than the fact that it was dirty. And I'm old enough that dirty water meant polio. So I grew up scared of water, you know, that simple. It was an accidental meeting with Pete Seeger. You couldn't read that letter probably very well, but what that letter was talking about was how he and I met rebuilding a dock in Beacon, New York in 1973, and he cajoled me into volunteering for Clearwater, which turned into a staff position, which then launched my
Who do you think said that? Any ideas? You have to like go back more than 50 years. FDR? Nope. All right, so Martin Luther King said that. Martin Luther King Jr. The whole society we seek is one in which all live in brotherhood with each other. It is a society that will not tolerate slums for some and decent houses for others, rats for some and playgrounds for others. It does not make sense to say that we cannot afford to win the fight against hunger and poverty. Any ideas? This may surprise you. That was said by Senator Ed Muskie on the first Earth Day. This was a principle, and this was the heart of the first Earth Day. The heart of the first Earth Day was environmental justice before we ever coined that term. This is about all of America and its problems. It is rats in the ghetto. It is a hungry child in a land of affluence. Housing that is not worthy of the name. Neighborhoods not fit to inhabit. Our goal is a new American ethic that sets new standards for progress, emphasizing human dignity and well-being. Senator Gaylord Nelson, at his Earth Day speech in Denver, Colorado, he was the founder of Earth Day. This was the heart of the environmental movement 5 decades ago. It wasn't just about air. It wasn't just about water. It wasn't just about open spaces. It was about poverty. It was about hunger. It was about the poor distribution of wealth. It was about housing. It was about the condition of inner cities. That's what the first environmental movement was about. And one of the things I want to talk about today is how are we going to rediscover that? And how are we going to connect that to our human right to water? They were building on something. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing women who are organized and who are demonstrating to form the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Civil rights marches. Mama Joe's in there somewhere. The peace movement. I was there for certain. That was my early activism. I was an anti-war activist. I was a draft counselor for the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and an anti-war organizer when I was 17, 18, 19, 20. And went to all the demonstrations. And then this. Earth Day, the environmental movement was built on the social and civil rights movements and the tradition of American activism, American advocacy, marching, lobbying, doing whatever was necessary. But all those issues were supposed to be connected. Let's see if you can guess this one. In pursuing our goals of full employment, better housing, excellence in education, in rebuilding our cities and improving our rural areas, in protecting our environment, and enhancing the quality of life. And all these and more, we will and must press urgently. Any ideas? I wasn't expecting you to know, so don't feel bad. Right? Richard Nixon. So profound was the connection of all these issues in the early 1970s that Richard Nixon felt compelled to say this. When he was elected, his transition team formed an environmental task force who told him the environment has got to be a key issue of your first term. This is the front page headline after his first State of the Union address. Nixon stressing quality of life, asks in State of the Union message for battle to save the environment. Front page, New York Times. Now, I ask you to stop for a second here and reflect back on these that I just showed you. Does any of this resemble the modern environmental movement as we know it? Very little, very little. But our roots are there and we have to rediscover them. And in the middle of all that is the human right to water. Every year, drinking water causes 20 million illnesses due to bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Pathogenic contamination of drinking water is endemic in the United States. There are a lot of other issues. There's lead, there's radioactive waste. The human species has been battling this fight for over a century, keeping our wastes and our pathogens separate from our water. 90 million illnesses due to recreational water. Same thing, pathogenic contamination. This is tens of thousands of people a day here in the United States. This is your last quiz. Ever since I became a teacher at Case University, I can't help myself. I give quizzes everywhere I go. My family hates me. We have subjected enormous numbers of people to contact with these poisons without their consent and often without their knowledge. If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons, it is surely only because our forefathers, despite their wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem. This is one of the greatest expressions of our right to a clean environment and our right to know. And Rachel Parsons said it in Silent Spring. 61 years ago. That principle also has to be at the heart of what we do going forward. And we're memorializing it everywhere we turn. This is the United Nations Declaration on Human Right to Water and Sanitation. Clean drinking water and sanitation are essential to the realization of all human rights. Madam mentioned the constitutional amendment we just passed. Overwhelmingly, 2-to-1 margin in New York State. Each person shall have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Can you have a right to clean water if you don't have the right to know if your water is clean? Who here has drank water today? In any form, coffee, water. Who here can tell me what was in the water they drank? Raise your hand if you can tell me what was in the water that you drank. You can't. You can't. How will we ever realize that right? How will we ever realize what the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act intended if we can't know this very simple thing of what is in my glass of water before I put it to my mouth? Madam mentioned this. Just want to mention it again. Here are the goals of the Clean Water Act. Eliminate discharge of pollutants by 85. Goal of water. I want to focus on the second one just for a second, so the panels ahead try and integrate this into your discussion. That second goal was put into the Clean Water Act because the Clean Water Act, when it was being written, because it was missing any ecological goals. That's why it's there. So they wrote that. It's very profound. And goal of water quality for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. Oops. Think about that for a second. That's a deer walking down a hill and sipping water out of the Hudson River. That's otter. That's fish. That's insects. That's, I mean, you know, this was supposed to mean something. And here's what happened when it was written. The people who were working on it said, you can't have an ecological goal sitting all by itself. Nobody's going to like it. It's going to raise a lot of questions. So they said, all right, let's add recreation. I hate to say it, Swimmable, Fishable was an afterthought in Clean Water Act to buffer the ecological goal. More importantly, look at these dates. The #1 goal of the Clean Water Act in 2023 is to end the discharge of pollutants 38 years ago. That's our goal. The goal ahead of us is to end discharge of pollutants 38 years ago. Now, I've had some lawyers say to me, this is aspirational. It's not a requirement. What does the law aspire to do now? What's the aspiration? Look at the second one. You can't get more specific. July 1st, 1983. These have long gone. We're not close. We're not remotely close. And Congress has not amended the law to change the goals, so we have something to shoot for. There isn't a state in the nation that has a plan for ending water pollution. Not one. The EPA has no plan for ending water pollution. The Clean Water Act is supposed to end water pollution. Is the Hudson River clean enough to swim, drink or swim? I can answer that easily. I have no idea, because nobody can tell me. You can't tell me. You can tell me what it was a week ago, but you can't tell me what's in there when I go into now, or anybody else is drinking water. Here's what I can tell you. I can tell you the pollen count. I can tell you the weather of Mars. I can tell you what's in potato chips. I cannot tell you if there's cryptosporidium in the water, which sickened 403,000 people in Milwaukee and killed 100 in 1993, and they still do not have a real-time detection system for cryptosporidium, as deadly as it is. You have a right to clean water. You have a right to know if your water is clean. What we need is, we need a New York State Clean Water Act. It's not worth going to Washington, as far as I'm concerned right now, but we can start in the state. The state can have stricter laws than the federal government. We need a New York State Clean Water that has new goals that are achievable, that has research and development money that will support those goals, and those goals will be tracked and measured. The New York State Clean Water Act. What we don't need is more people being told that they should have filters and home tests. Who can least afford to keep on buying home tests and new filters? Who suffers the most? Is that our solution to drinking water? No. No. Go back to those quotes in the beginning. That's not a civil right. That's not a human right. Your human right to have a water filter. The people who can least afford it are going to be the people who are most affected. I wanted to show you my kids. This is the Blue Collab team. They are working on research and development and innovation of real-time water monitoring. Matter of fact, they have a text bot that you can dial into and find out the water quality in our campus pond in the last 15 minutes. But here's something I just want to do for you real quick, because I know I have to wrap up. They are imagining a very different future. They're imagining a future not only of real-time information, they're imagining a future where we relate to water differently, where we use different parts of our brain, where we get enthusiastic about water all over again and integrate it into our lives. And here is something that one of my students did. You know what that is? That's the water quality data from our pond. We turned it into music. The student who did it has a blind friend. It's a year's worth of temperature, turbidity, and pH. I'm so proud. We have to think differently. We have to rediscover those rights, those ideas that the environmental movement was founded upon. We have to recognize water as an absolute right. We have to recognize that we have a right to know what's in water before we use it, before we drink it. It will require tens of millions of dollars of technological innovation to make that happen. Stuff my students are working on to really make it happen. But it's our right. So when the EPA, the Department of Health, says to you, you're going to get an annual report about your drinking water quality on June 30th of this year, and that annual water quality report is going to be about January to December of last year. Some of the data 17 months old, some of it 5 months old, and you can use that to protect your health. What you say to the EPA and the Department of Health is, what do you think, I'm stupid? That is not a fulfillment of my right to know. That is not a fulfillment of my right to clean water. We have to start at the state level and write a brand new Clean Water Act that incorporates health goals, that incorporates goals to end the discharge of pollutants, and do what the Clean Water Act has failed to do. Thank you very much.
No, can we have one question?
What's that?
One question
Oh,
or more of a comment? New York State Senate and Assembly do not have a water committee. So when you say we need this, that would be first step is we need a committee. We have health, we have mental health, we have gambling, you know, we can go on, we all know all the committees. There's no water. They send it to environmental conservation. It's something I think it's very important that.
are you talking about the legislature?
Yeah,
Yeah, there should be a subcommittee on drinking water. It's drinking water has become a disaster, not only in New York State, but nationwide.
well,
The folks in Newburgh and the folks in Hoosick Falls found out about PFAS in their drinking water years after it happened. And Hoosick Falls, the only way it was found out was that a resident took samples and went to a laboratory. Fast forward 2 years, and the companies have created a $60 million fund for the victims. Victims of drinking water. This is 2023, and we have victims of drinking water. And I'll tell you one of the things we have to do. We have to change our vocabulary. Everybody know what food poisoning is? Anybody here had food poisoning? If some of you had, let's start saying water poisoning. Let's start saying what it really is. Water poisoning. We got to change our vocabulary. In the legislature, they do not pay enough attention to water. There should be a subcommittee on drinking water, and there is not.
no, I argue that there should not be a subcommittee, which is why I specifically say there's a full committee on health, there's a full committee on mental health, which one would think would be a subcommittee. There's full committees on gambling, etc. I would like to see a full committee on water because it is beyond drinking water. It's watersheds, it's potable water, but it's storm water, it's wastewater going into drinking water bodies. So
Well, yeah, so
we need a whole lot.
yeah, you just said one thing. In New York State, drinking water is the bailiwick of the Department of Health. All other water is the bailiwick of the Environmental Conservation Department. So it's divided. The water rules are buried in the state sanitary code, which also tells you how day camps are supposed to be regulated. What we need to do, following what you're saying, what we need to do is we need to bring all the water laws together in one body of law. And I agree, a legislative committee on water would be excellent, but we first have to bring the law together. Because right now, it's a disaster as far as regulation goes. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, John. And now I'd like to welcome the first panel. And we have the privilege this morning for the Swimmable panel that Fran Dunwell, who essentially founded and coordinated the Hudson River Estuary Program. So although we still have a lot of challenges and difficulties and a long way to go, the quality of the Hudson River is so greatly improved by her contribution. So I'd like to welcome Fran, Jeff Anzabino from Scenic Hudson, Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper, and Emily Vale from the Hudson River Watershed Alliance to please come up, and I will turn it over to Fran and our panelists for a really valuable next presentation. Thank you.
Jeff.
It's set. I know there are a lot of people who are attending this conference online. So it's really important to make sure that we have all of those. Are we ready?
Yeah, we are also.
So it's great to be here. It's great to see everyone. And I was reflecting as John spoke earlier today about my first experiences on the Hudson. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, not in sight of the Hudson, but in hearing distance of the Hudson. I could hear the train go by, especially at night. And John was talking about how when he was growing up, and he and I grew up at a similar time frame, people were scared of the Hudson, and that was certainly the case in my family. I recall my neighbors had a little boat. I was invited to go out on the boat on the Hudson at one point, and I actually don't remember the boat ride. All I remember is I had to get a shot in order to go on the boat. Because if I fell in, the river was so polluted, my family was terrified that I would get some deathly illness. And when you're out on the Hudson at this time, people are out there fishing. Pretty soon people will be out there swimming in the Hudson. It's hard to imagine that the river was that polluted, literally since I was a teenager. So it does give us some sense of how things have improved a lot in one person's lifetime. But as John said, we really have a long way to go. In introducing the panel, I wanted to just make a couple of points. One is that the early phases of the Clean Water Act didn't really have strong enforcement. And Clearwater has played such an important role in creating the Clean Water Act, campaigning for it, Pete and others going to Washington with Earth Day to make the point that people needed to clean up our state and national waterways. Clearwater also began having festivals up and down the Hudson River. And I attended one of those festivals. And it was at that time that I read the Clearwater Navigator. I don't know, maybe John, you wrote it. Probably. And it talked about the problems of pollution in the Hudson. And I became very inspired. Like, this is what I would really like to devote my life to. And I was really fortunate to be able to develop a lifetime of conservation activism through both the Center for the Hudson River Valley, where I first worked, Scenic Hudson, where I later worked, and eventually through the United States Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, where I worked from 1984 until last year. So Clearwater has really been the inspiration for me and for many other people, and I'm really glad that Clearwater is convening this today. So there are a couple points that we're going to be making throughout the panel today. One is the importance of enforcement, which the People's Pipe Watch was instrumental in getting the Clean Water Act to be enforced through Clearwater and later through Riverkeeper and others. The importance of money. Clean water doesn't happen without huge investments. The 1965 Pure Waters Bond Act kicked that off. The Clean Water Act provided federal funding. Most recently, over $1 billion has been committed just in New York State towards clean water cleanups. The importance of setting time-bound goals. The Clean Water Act had a goal of clean water by 1985. When I came to the DEC, we set a goal through our action agenda that the river would be swimmable by 2009. The time-bound goals give you a sense of urgency and are really important to help motivate people. The importance of nonprofit organizations and coalition building. The investments in clean water in New York State are a direct result of some of the coalitions that have been organized with labor and environmental groups in the state. And that provides the support that's needed for political leadership. And we've been really blessed in New York to have strong political leaders who will be and have been championing clean water for the state on a bipartisan basis. And then, as John mentioned, the importance of reports and monitoring. People really need to know what's happening with their water quality. Is it getting cleaner? Are there problems? Where do we stand? So with that, I will wrap up my introduction. And I will ask if we could begin with Jeff Anzavino, who's going to talk a little bit about access.
Thanks, Brian. Will there be slides? Oh, yes, look at that. We'll just say when to advance.
Do you want, or you could come up here and click them?
Oh, that's perfect. Hey, I'm just gonna. Thank you, Fran, and thanks everyone for being here. It's especially heartening to see young people in the audience, and I want to especially welcome them because I think they really are our future. And if I can figure out how to advance this, like Fran, I grew up on the Hudson River, but unlike Fran, I wasn't afraid of swimming in 1966 through 1972. We water skied, we swam, Croton Point, and but you know that's another story. Oh, yes, thank you very much. All right, so I love this picture. Speaking of young people, you know, the dock at Warriors Park, climate change is coming. We have a hot day today. People really want to swim, I think, in the river more than ever. And here they are trying to make the best of it. And you can use the mouse. There we go. There you go. It's our Scenic Hudson's mission. All right, we want to enhance the river and the valley for generations to come. Managing your Rip Van Winkle. And I'm going to preface this, John, I loved your call to action, and I feel a little bit remiss now by saying we've come a long way because we do have a long way to go. But imagine your Rip Van Winkle when you fell asleep 50 years ago or 32 years ago when I came to the Hudson Valley. What was the river like? So think about Yonkers. There was a big parking lot there in downtown Yonkers. Now the Sawmill River has been daylighted. Tarrytown was that concrete and asphalt plant. Now there is a park with a mixed-use development. Irvington had a lumber yard, school bus storage. Now it's a park. The abandoned railroad bridge, abandoned since 1974, now hosts 500,000 people a year to come and marvel at the bounty of the Hudson River. And if we didn't have shades here, we could look across the river. In 1960, 1970, you know, rail yard, scrap yard, polluted site. Now we have a beautiful park that many people come to enjoy. So we've had a lot of positive change over 50 years, but challenges do remain, as John has reminded us, not only with respect to water quality, but how we get to the river and how we need to continue to get to the river. So this brings us back to these children in young women in the city of Poughkeepsie. We need more Hudson River access. People may remember in 1989 with a report done called Between the Railroad and the River, hand-drawn maps. I'm not quite sure who did that. God bless them for doing that. Of course, it looked at sites between the railroad and the river because the railroad presented a huge barrier to riverfront access. And those barriers still remain, and the railroad is one. I'll talk about a couple things really quickly. The village of Castleton on Hudson, up near Albany, is a small village, about 2,000 people. There is no riverfront access for the people that live, public access for the people that live in that village. This gate has been up for about 28 years, fencing off, preventing access to their undeveloped municipal riverfront park that was funded by New York State. We would like to help the village of Castleton get at-grade crossing with modern crossing infrastructures to that site. Now, if you lived if you wanted to look 900 feet to the south, you see that kind of marina. You could walk across that tracks. You could trailer your boat across that tracks to get to the river. But if you're just some ordinary person, you can't walk to your riverfront park. There is a whole series of historic truss bridges that span the railroad tracks that have been abandoned. Nobody knows who owns them. Many of them are in parks like Mills Norris State Park, the home of FDR, National Historic Site. Those bridges need to be fixed, rehabilitated, reopened so people can get to the river. The one at the FDR site is particularly problematic because it's in very bad shape. It was flagged in 2010 and 2014 by DOT for immediate removal. Somehow it still stands. If repaired, that could provide a Hudson River Valley Greenway water trail site so people could paddle there, get out of their kayak, walk across that bridge, walk the beautiful trails, and enjoy the Wallace Center in the home of FDR. The Calvert Box Preservation Alliance is working to fix that one that you see on the lower right. That's what it might look like in just a few months. Riverfront development, poorly planned riverfront development that chokes off riverfront access. We see in the upper right a large development proposed in the town of Stony Point. There are a lot of good people fighting against this. They've got a public space is set aside for public access in the front, but it doesn't go anywhere. And I believe it's going to function more like a private park for the people that live there than the people in Stony Point that want to actually go there and use it. In the lower right, you can see a development in Poughkeepsie with a very narrow waterfront walkway. So the public riverfront in these developments needs to be substantial and continuous and ungated, like the one we have there at the right. In industrial legacy industrial plants that no longer require a riverfront location. People are fighting against the dance camera plants, and there are we make great gains there as well. So what are we doing about this? So the Scenic Hudson has prepared a Hudson River access plan. We did it in 2020 that covered the area between Poughkeepsie and Rensselaer. We were on a tight time frame then. We wanted to stop Amtrak from building gates and fencing that would keep people from getting to the river to fish at places where they've been, for doing that safely for generations. Now we have expanded that plan. It'll be released in June, and it's going to cover the rest of the river all the way down to through Westchester County and the whole western shore up to Waterford. We had 6 weeks of good public comments, about 10,000 comments and votes came in, and the Department of State tells us that municipalities and others can use this as the basis for their LWRPs, their local waterfront revitalization programs or comprehensive plans. There's a lot of data and analysis and recommendations in there. Here's what the plan will look like. There will be, oh my gosh, I don't know how many, there were 70 in the first plan, probably about 200 different site sheets like this that describes each site, how people want to use it, and what are the recommendations. So let's just summarize. We've made a lot of progress. There are a lot of, all these industrial sites have been, not all of them, sorry. Many of the industrial sites have been cleaned up. Many have been turned into parks, to mixed-use developments. We have a lot more public access than we had. The railroad is still a barrier. We need to address that. And we need better planning. We need your involvement in these decision-making processes and intergovernmental, interagency cooperation, particularly with respect to those trust bridges. We need Amtrak, DOT, the railroads, and others to step up and work together. And what can you do? First, I want everyone to celebrate our successes, to get out there and enjoy the river, participate in your local planning processes, make sure that your community has a comprehensive plan and a local waterfront revitalization program, and keep apprised of Scenic Hudson's river access initiatives. There's the website. You can go there and find out to do even more. So I think I can take questions at that email or whenever it's appropriate on the panel. Thank you.
Our next speaker on the topic of the Swimmable Hudson is Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper.
Thanks, Brad. So I'm Dan Shapley. I'm with Riverkeeper, and Riverkeeper's mission is to protect and restore the Hudson River. My friend John Cronin, our first speaker, was a foundational piece of what we have at Riverkeeper today. We also work on protecting drinking water, which I won't be talking about today, even though it's a subject close and near and dear to my heart. I do just want to mention quickly, because we're in Newburgh, and when we think of drinking water, we think of Newburgh. This glass of water is from the back here. Everyone thinks of the contamination, think of water crisis. But I just want to remind everyone, this water right here is from the Catskill Aqueducts, New York City's protected reservoirs, and then it's run through filtration that not even New York City gets. So this water right here is good. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the city are still buying bottled water, and that's a tragedy on top of a crisis. All right, so what I'm talking about today, people swim, but they could and they should swim more. The water quality is much better than it was, as we've heard already today, than the dawn of the Clean Water Act, but it's not consistently swimmable. Watershed work and infrastructure work really are what's making that water quality better, but weak standards, weak implementation of the Clean Water Act and climate change present risks to increased progress. And I do just want to pause briefly. I took the slide out on this. I'm adding it back in. I'm going to go over time. But we are on the land of the Esopus Conservancy. I'm sorry. the Esopus Confederacy, the Wahoranak Council Fire, and the cultures that were here before European colonization had, as we're all familiar, 7th generation concept of decision making. Thinking, how is this going to affect 7 generations out? And I would say we spent probably 10 generations or so really extracting from the river, polluting the river, treating the river as other than us. The native way of thinking was and is to think of us as part of the environment part of us, the river as a relation. And we're probably a few generations from really getting there, but I think the Clean Water Act takes us a step towards it. It also, though, maintains this sense of separation of the purpose is how we use the water. Is it good enough for us to drink? Is it good enough for us to swim in? It doesn't view the water as having its own rights and its own need to exist in a clean and healthy way. So for today, though, is the Hudson swimmable? I would say that there are 2 basic tests for that. One is a non-Clean Water Act test, which is, can we get there? Jeff just spoke to that. Is the water available to us? Can we get to a beach? This is a polar bear swim in Ossining. This photo happened just this winter. The other question is the Clean Water Act test. Does it meet the swimmable criteria that the EPA and our state government, DEC, set in order to define what clean water is? How clean is clean enough? So if we look back, who swam in the Hudson? This is from Fran's report from about 20 years ago. The estuary program put out looking at the potential for more swimming in the river. And back, just 3 or 4 generations ago, we had millions of people swimming in the Hudson. Bathhouses, river pools, beaches. That was the norm. Fast forward to today, we have just 4 beaches, only 3 of which are public on the whole Hudson River. 1 river pool across the way in Beacon. So as a result, one of the consequences is that we have a lot of places, at least 10 times as many roughly, that river keepers documented from observations from our patrol boat, where people are getting in the water as if it's a public beach, but it's not a public beach. There's no lifeguard. It's not as safe. It's not formal. So we know if we had more beaches, we had more pools, people would use them. If you build it, they will come. We have a lot of open water swimming. This chart shows participation in open water swim events over time. And the dip there, the 2019 dip is because the triathlon, New York City Triathlon was canceled because of poor water quality. And then the other 2 are because of the pandemic cutting down on activities of all kinds. And now, so we're just seeing a resurgence. But we have these open water swim events, and many of them take place over time or recur. So 57 different days of the year, we need the water clean just for those public swim events. Over 5,000 people participate in them. So it's an indication. These are the leading edge. If they're out there, we all would be out there, and we want to enjoy that. So who would swim in the Hudson? We need to give more access. We know from a survey that the estuary program did 5 years ago or so, about 1 in 4 residents of the Hudson Valley already swim or visit beaches. About 1 in 5 paddleboard, swim, boat, kayak, boat, taking part in that kind of activity. The plus pools, this exciting floating pool concept that's being proposed for the East River, just around the corner from the Hudson. Ossining's looking to expand and open up access at its beach, which I just want to point out, Ossining had an active beach, and I bet there are other communities like this I just don't know the history of, but Ossining's beach closed when it went from white only to integrated. And then somebody lit the floating dock on fire and sunk it, and there's been no swimming for decades from that beach. It's not the water quality, it was racism in that case. So we can right historic wrongs, to John's point from to start us off, by promoting this access in at least a small way. Little Stony Point's another example where there's activity, at least talk about potentially turning a informal public access site that's popular for swimming into something that's more formal. And then a number of other sites that have been identified in that great report that Fran put out 20 years ago. So the big question though is who can get to the river? Many of us, as I just pointed out, don't have access. But if you have a boat or if you have a car, you can get places, you can find your way to the river. A lot of our environmental justice communities, a lot of our brown and black neighbors, a lot of our poor neighbors do not have that access. They have harder time finding those points. And again, when they get there, there's not a lifeguard. It's not as safe. So we need to expand that access. And then sea level rise, I mean, beaches are the lowest point. And the sea level rise is going to swamp the sites we have. It's going to make other sites less developable as river sites. So we really need to think about, as we are getting hotter, we want to get in the water, will we have that access? Now on to, is the water clean enough? This is just a quick chart to kind of explain a very small part of how the Clean Water Act works. You start on the upper left. We start by saying, what is the use of this water? How do we want to use this water? Is it drinking water? It needs to be this clean. Are we going to swim in it? It needs to be this clean. Is it clean enough that we don't kill the fish that are living there? It needs to be this clean. That's the basic idea. We start by designating each stretch of water with a classification. Then we say, what criteria do you have to meet to achieve that use? And then we have to assess the water. We measure, test the water and say, is it meeting that criteria to support that use? And if it is, great, we're supposed to maintain it in that way. We're supposed to update, for instance, our permits for discharges every 5 years to ratchet down the level of pollution into zero by 1983 or 1985. And if it's not meeting that, then we need to restore it. And I think you'll hear from Emily after me about, at least in part, about the Wallkill River and a restoration plan there. We have very few of these plans happening under the Clean Water Act. For the Hudson and swimming, our water quality criteria are outdated for fresh water. We have in New York relying on standards. This is bacteria indicating whether sewage might be affecting the water. We're relying on standards that have not been recommended by the EPA since 1986. And I know 1986 well because it's the last year before 2023 that the Mets won the World Series. The designated uses, so defining whether the river, whether we have set the goal of swimmable for the Hudson. We have only set the goal of swimmable for the Hudson really from about Catskill down to the New York City line. North of that in the Capital District, we are not setting the goal. We have not set the goal of swimmable there. We have also not set the swimmable goal for the Manhattan shoreline of the Hudson River by that designated use. So the criteria, therefore, is not being asked to meet the goal of swimmable under the Clean Water Act, our implementation of it here in New York State. Finally, assessment. Really, there's no data collected to see if we're meeting those criteria or those uses. No data collected by the state, that is. Now, very importantly, just this week, New York State proposed new criteria for the waters around New York City to meet, to define swimmable and to define kayakable, for lack of a better word, water standards, to try and modernize the water standards for saline water. So this affects everything from the Bear Mountain South and all around New York City. Riverkeeper doesn't have information yet about how to comment on this on our website. We will shortly. I urge you to take action here. The simple thing to know is that the EPA gives two options for setting the swimmable goal to states. One is clean and one is a little less clean. New York is choosing the easier of the two. So urge us to go farther, hit the higher standard, try to get to more protective criteria. Importantly, in about a year's time, we will get a second rule for these same waters around New York City that will ask the question, should the Hudson be swimmable? Should the East River be swimmable? Should the Harlem River be swimmable? Should we set that goal in the designated use? We will need your voices on that as well. So Riverkeeper is gathering data to answer the question, is it swimmable? Even if New York State isn't or other entities are not. The simple answer after 12 or so years of data collection is that most of the river is safe, meeting EPA criteria most of the time, but not everywhere and especially not after rain. So very quickly, I have a lot of materials over here. You can take this home. If you have if you're online, you can't take any of it home. But if you're in the room, and especially if you're in a classroom of some kind, I have posters. I'd love for you to take one. If you had a boat club or a kayaking club, something like that, we have to put this on the wall, please do. But it uses this system, red, not safe, generally not safe for swimming, yellow, risky after rain, or green, generally safe. And again, I would encourage you to explore this in more detail because I'm out of time. But in general, shorelines, tributaries, more likely to be risky away from the shoreline in the Hudson River, more likely and almost always likely to find good water quality for swimming relative to the EPA criteria. Climate's going to change the dynamic though. We already are seeing when we get really extreme storms, the whole river can become unsafe for swimming, which is unusual. Usually we see a lot of variation, but these big storms we've been getting with all the runoff and all of the overflows and the leaky pipes, we get this kind of situation. So what do we need to do? We have 160 sewer plants in the Hudson River watershed, publicly owned, and a whole bunch more that are sort of in other categories. That's a good thing, right? That's what the Clean Water Act did. We want to treat the sewage, clean it up. But they're old. Many of them are at risk of flooding or sea level rise. We have thousands of miles of sewer pipe, many of which are over 65 years old. Who's older than 65 in the room? Your pipes work as well as they did when they were 10? We need to fix up the pipes. They're easier to fix than our pipes, but they're still expensive. And we have these combined sewer overflows, which are designed to spill sewage when it rains. We're working to clean them up, but we're not going to eliminate them even under the Clean Water Act, even in the next 10 or 15 years. So quickly, this photo, the building you are in is that building. Underneath us in the street right out here is a $32 million sewer project to reduce sewer overflows into the Hudson River. And I want to acknowledge that it is these guys, Wayne and Jason and their crews, that do that work. And that is up and down the Hudson Valley. I'd add, I think Fran said money, nonprofits, the law, and then it's competent workers in our cities to apply for the money and to do the projects. And we have really good people in Newburgh. Out of time, I'm sorry, but some serious priorities. We need to keep the money flowing. We passed the Bond Act last year. That's great. This project under our feet is funded largely by the bipartisan infrastructure law, federal. We need to vote for the people who are going to invest in that infrastructure, keep that going. We need to upgrade our water quality standards immediately. We have the opportunity in New York. We need to get more pools and beaches so that we can enjoy the water. And we need to focus on both water quality and access in our climate adaptation planning because both are at risk from climate change. Finally, I urge you to go to riverkeeper.org/take action. There are a few actions there right now. There will be more relevant to these issues over time as they are timely. The last thing I want to say, this shirt's great, right? Clearwater.org. I work for Riverkeeper. This is Clearwater.org. It's 30 bucks, I think. Yeah. Everywhere I go, people say, how do I get that shirt? Buy it. Clearwater. Support Clearwater. Do it for Mana. And if you don't want to buy a shirt, buy a mug. We all need more mugs. Yeah. If you don't want to do that, just make a donation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, I'm not sure if this microphone is on. Is this?
Just tap it.
I turned it off.
Oh, just hold your finger.
We'll let Emily. Here we go. Yeah, all right. So we've heard about getting to the water for this being able to swim. We've heard about achieving water quality and the importance of monitoring of money. And one of the things we're going to hear about now is how the job is never done. There are always emerging issues. And Emily is going to talk about harmful algae blooms. Emily, take it away.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to be behind, but you can't see me, so I'm going to be out here a little bit. Great. Thank you so much, Fran, Mana, the whole team put this together. Really excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about harmful algal blooms as a specific type of water quality challenge as we're thinking about clean water and swimmability into the future. So before I start, I'm just wondering how many of you have heard of HABs? Just like I've heard of this before. Great. How many of you have seen a harmful algal bloom in person with your eyeballs? Great. Okay, so for those of you who haven't, I'm showing a lot of photos that can appear in a lot of different ways. And it's really important to have eyes on our waterways. So you'll have a sense of all the different ways these harmful algal blooms can present themselves. So you can keep an eye out. All right, so I'm going to be giving some background on harmful algal blooms. I'll be talking about documented harmful algal blooms in the Hudson River watershed with a particular case study on some of the issues in the Wallkill River and some next steps. So I'll be talking about the acronym HABs, which is harmful algal blooms. Before I do, just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Emily Vale. I'm the executive director of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. We're a regional nonprofit that works throughout the Hudson River watershed to unite and empower communities to protect our shared waters. We do this through supporting watershed groups, improving intermunicipal coordination, and communicating as a collective voice across the region. We've got some handouts and materials, including our strategic plan, which is what's pictured here on the table over there if you want to take a look. So what is a harmful algal bloom? A harmful algal bloom is one that can or does produce toxins. So either it has the potential to, or it does produce those toxins. We're talking in this case about cyanobacteria, which is also called blue-green algae. These are the most common harmful algal blooms in New York State. There are other HABs that affect marine waters. These are primarily freshwater algal blooms. And of course, algae is a critical part of aquatic ecosystems. Algae in and of itself is not a problem. It's really a foundational part of our aquatic ecosystems. But it can become harmful if it produces toxins. And these particular types of HABs are really good at out-competing other types of algae, resulting in this very green paint mixed in pea soup, swirling mass of toxins. So these toxins are usually associated with the active bloom area. So where you're seeing that green color is where the toxins are most likely to be. So if you're not seeing the green, less likely. These toxins can harm people and animals, primarily through skin exposure, but also through ingestion if you swallow it, or through inhalation if they become airborne. So that can be a particular concern if you're irrigating with contaminated water, if you could breathe it in. So again, drinking and swallowing is especially of concern. That's the riskiest level of exposure. And I get a lot of questions, well, how does this affect the fish? It's not great for them. It has reduced dissolved oxygen impacts. When that algae dies, it eats up the dissolved oxygen. It stresses fish and other organisms, but the toxins are not necessarily toxic to the fish, right? So they're stressed in these kinds of conditions. So the symptoms most typical are gastrointestinal, might include nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Could be skin or throat irritation. It may be like an allergic reaction or asthma-like breathing difficulties. Certain toxins affect the liver or the nervous system, so those are neurotoxins. And people vary in their sensitivity to exposure to harmful algal blooms. So just like some of us are really sensitive to the spring tree pollen and others are not, some people may be really sensitive to the toxins that are produced by harmful algal blooms. But people's pets and livestock are certainly at higher risk, and particularly dogs that might jump in to a bloom and then lick it off their fur, really quite dangerous. It can be a risk of dying for those dogs. So what causes a harmful algal bloom? The causes are not fully understood. It can be a little bit complex to predict when these things are going to pop up. But in general, the conditions that are best suited to these blooms are high temperatures, high light exposure, high levels of nutrients, really meaning nitrogen, but particularly phosphorus, and low flow or calm water. So most often these blooms are happening in nutrient-rich waters, especially during hot, calm weather. And that is exactly when people want to be on the river, cooling off. And we have seen numerous people recreating directly through harmful algal blooms. Not great, right? This is a pretty risky thing. During some of the bloom conditions, I've been documenting these, taking photographs and talking to people, and some people really don't know about the risks. I talked to one couple with a small infant during the Wallkill River bloom of 2016. They were ready, their infant was in a little floaty thing, and they said, can we go swimming here? It doesn't look great. And I said, oh my God, no, this could be really dangerous for your infant if there's exposure. The stand-up paddleboard pictured here, I called out to her and I said, hey, harmful algal bloom. She said, yeah, I know. We just kept on paddling. So there may be some messaging challenges, even if people know, they might not be fully aware of some of the risks. But of course, when it's really hot out, when it's been dry, this is exactly when we want to be using our waterways and swimming or paddling. So here's a picture of the Sturgeon Pool Beach. Sturgeon Pool is a lake that's part of the Wallkill River. This is Central Hudson's bathing beach that was closed due to harmful algal bloom conditions. So of course, we're expecting these types of conditions more often with climate change and extreme weather. So we may get heavy rainstorms that wash a lot of phosphorus from the watershed into these water bodies, followed by very hot and dry conditions, which then might cause these blooms. So as we're thinking about climate change, extreme weather, we're likely to be seeing more of these harmful algal blooms, which is an emerging challenge for the Clean Water Act and swimming in our water bodies. So harmful algal blooms have been observed throughout the Hudson River watershed, numerous lakes and ponds, far too many to mention. Many drinking water reservoirs have been documented with harmful algal blooms. This is a real challenge because while drinking water treatment plants are monitoring for these types of toxins, there have been cases where the toxins go through the treatment facility and could be exposing people. So we saw this happen in Owasco Lake in New York State in the Finger Lakes, something to really keep an eye out and really support our municipal folks who are dealing with this. But interestingly, harmful algal blooms are also showing up in our rivers and streams. So very common in lakes and ponds, that's much more expected, but rivers and streams is more unusual. So the Masonic Creek in Orange County has had documented HABs, the Wappinger Creek in Dutchess County, and also the Hudson River in Beacon. And so we tend to think of the Hudson River as a nutrients are not the main challenge, right? There's a lot of other challenges, but the system is light limited. We're not so worried about harmful algal blooms or excess nutrients as we are in places like the Chesapeake Bay. However, we are seeing harmful algal blooms pop up on occasion in embayments of the Hudson River where that flow is really slow and where there are high levels of nutrients. So this is really something to keep an eye out for as we're dealing with changing climate conditions and changing water body conditions. So I'll talk a little bit now about the Wallkill River harmful algal blooms. I've got some photos here. This really rose to our collective attention starting in 2015, although there may have been blooms previous to that. We had 1 or 2 days of really, really vibrant green water, followed by, and this is the typo, this should be 2016, quite an extensive bloom in 2016, and more recently this past summer also had a very extensive bloom on the Wallkill. So in 2016, we had 30 miles of the Wallkill River impacted by harmful algal blooms for about 60 days. That stretched from the town of Montgomery in Orange County all the way to the town of Esopus near Kingston. In 2022, we had 15 miles of the tidal Rondout Creek and the Wallkill River. So the Wallkill River flows into the tidal Rondout Creek in Ripton. And what was interesting there is, I think to our knowledge, this was the first time we saw harmful algal blooms in a tidal tributary of the Hudson River. So those are places where we expect flowing water due to the tides. And so it was pretty surprising to find those there. So again, so important to keep an eye out on places where this historically may not have been a challenge. So in 2022, the harmful algal bloom extended from New Paltz all the way towards Kingston and lasted for about 25 days. And this map shows some of those documented sites in 2022. So during each of these, the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance, which is a community-based watershed group working to protect the Wallkill River watershed, they've really played a critical role in monitoring, particularly with their science working group and some of the scientists on staff who happen to be nutrient and algae experts, with their outreach and coordination, working to get the word out, making sure signs are posted at public access points, and making sure it's hit the press so people really understood the risks. So the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is working on a total maximum daily load, a TMDL, for phosphorus for the Wallkill River. This is part of the Clean Water Act. So when the state regulatory agency monitors and finds that water bodies are impaired for a particular type of pollutant, it is required that a TMDL is developed to take a look at where those pollutant sources might be coming from. And the DEC has done considerable water quality monitoring as well as modeling to identify sources in the Wallkill River of where the phosphorus may be coming from. So they've confirmed in the Wallkill River and its tributaries extremely high levels of phosphorus, and they're now working on identifying how best to reduce those levels. So they presented this at the Wallkill River Summit in the past, and they'll be presenting an update at an upcoming event on May 3rd at SUNY New Paltz, I think 8th annual Wallkill River Summit. So we're looking forward to getting some more information from that then. So in thinking about these sources, point sources, wastewater treatment plants, Dan talked a lot about that. Really important to make sure that wastewater is treated to an appropriate level. And they'll also be looking at non-point sources. So places where these pollutants may be coming off the landscape, whether it's stormwater, septic systems, agriculture, anything that's on the land that may be conveying into these water bodies. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that our wastewater treatment plant operators work really hard to maintain their permit compliance, and they're really working, they're on our side, they're really doing their best to clean up the water. And most of the wastewater that comes out of the outfall into the water body is clean. But we're finding, particularly with the aging infrastructure that Dan mentioned, is that these systems, these pipes are not in great shape. And in many cases, the source of these pollution may be from pipes that are cracking, pipes that are leaking into stormwater systems. And so our point sources are actually acting a little bit more like non-point sources, where they're distributed through the landscape and a lot harder to manage through permit requirements. So I think that this is a real opportunity for new funding like the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Bond Act, to really take a look at our sewer systems more broadly and find some solutions here. So just a couple of next steps. Just a reminder to stay out of discolored water because it may be a health risk to people, pets, and livestock. If you see harmful algal blooms, which many of you have, make sure you report them to the DEC May through October through the New York Harmful Algal Bloom System. This is a great way to check if other people have seen these blooms where it may or may not be safe to recreate. And especially in a changing climate, I think we really need to consider nutrients, temperature, and flow conditions while we're managing water bodies. And those may have been lower on the priority list in the past, and I think we need to bump those up, thinking about monitoring, planning, and implementation projects. And lastly, I really encourage you all to support your local watershed group. I know several of you out there are involved in your local watershed groups already. There is such value in watershed scale organizing and a need for a strong foundation of cross-municipal coordination. The work of the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance has brought people together so that when the TMDL is released, they already have municipalities that are at the table that are ready to be a part of the next steps. The Alliance has done significant scientific collaboration, bringing in resources from the Carey Institute and other academic institutions. And they're not telling people to avoid the Wallkill. They're really stewarding the water. They're encouraging people to get out. They're really taking care of this watershed and making sure that people are getting out on the water when it is safe. We don't want people to just avoid the water completely because it's such an asset and we need to turn towards the water, not away from it. So that's it from me. Thank you so much and looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, Emily. We have time for questions. I know.
Yeah, we can take about 3 or 4 questions from the audience. I'll wander towards the audience. And if not, maybe Fran, if you have something on your mind that you want to pose, and then that mic can come off and be passed around.
Okay. Yeah. We do have a question in the back. I think they're bringing a microphone to you.
Okay. That was wonderful. I'm trying. That was an excellent presentation, and it's good to see you. Hello, Dan. And actually, I have a question for you because I've been water sampling on the Hudson River down in Austin for about 8 years. Although I haven't done the frostbite swim, it's not in my vernacular. And actually, I was a teacher at Austin High School. We had a program where they were doing water quality sampling. And Dan, I think, I remember you saying that what drives environmental law and water quality water law is data. And what you said before, you have the green light, the yellow light, and the red light. And I was like, very visual, that's a great idea. It's a little bit of a question comment thing. In what ways, and I'll be honest, having sampled as much as I've done, especially in the summertime, there were times when there would be like rainstorms and the water was afterwards. And unfortunately, going back to what John Cronin said, we don't have instant sampling. It takes 24 hours for it to come in. And is there any way we could get more data, more sampling, and perhaps get our legislators to see the importance of this? And then it would open up, because I've seen rainy days when the water was fine. I've seen sunny days, not so much. So how do you, what would you say towards fixing that?
Yeah, thanks, Artie. Well, first of all, I would say if I said data drives change, I would agree, although it's really data and people every time. Data never does it on its own, in my experience. They're very, very rarely. The Walker River watershed alliance is a great example. I'd say the beach in Austin is a great example. Data alone isn't going to open that beach. It'll be if people want to do it. And the same goes for additional monitoring beyond what's required or making new requirements. It will take, technology, innovation, but also people wanting to use it, arguing within their communities or the state legislature to fund those things. And I think it has to be useful. Hudson River Park has a pretty good model. They built a model based on water quality testing, and then they use a similar sort of red-green system to tell people whether the water's safe. I think that would be a good thing to aim for in a lot of river communities where people want to use the water, is gather enough data to understand the pattern and then use that as a guide for when to get in the water. That's probably the most affordable, best way. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
Yeah. One of the things I'll add is that there's profound ignorance amongst state legislators about water quality. I had a meeting with a state senator last year, and I told him that he could text a phone number and get the latest data from 15 minutes ago from our pond on campus. And he said to me, "You mean I can't do that with my drinking water?"
Got people online.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I had a meeting with the state senator, I was saying last year, and I told him you could text a phone number and get the latest data from in 15 minutes from our pond on campus. And he said, "Well, I should be able to do that with my drinking water, right?" And I said, "No, you can't do that with your drinking water." I think there's an assumption that the state does, and I'm sure you've seen this, Dan. If Riverkeeper wasn't doing the sampling it's doing, nobody else would be doing it. I mean, what happens is we just jump in to the gap that the state has left and work it should be doing. And they've got to ramp it up, but legislators and rule makers are largely ignorant about how sampling is done and what the dangers are to the public.
Thank you, John. I think we have time for one or two more questions from the audience, if there are any. All right, we'll take these two and then we'll get ready to transition to the next panel.
Hi, Diane Dintrup in Southwest. One of the most useful tools that I found on the site was the Hudson River Valley Greenway site map, and I know the Empire State Trail, including a number of smaller water trails, which I know the Wildcat has a nice water trail map, but it's not included in, the Empire State Trail sites yet. But I was wondering, is there any plans to coordinate between the different agencies so that we could get the hazard warnings onto that site? When we go everywhere along the Hudson River kayaking, can we check the map, and find out at some point in the future if it would be safe or if we should go elsewhere?
I think I'll say that That doesn't exist at this time. But it's a great idea.
Yeah, hi Diane. So I think that the New York Habs mapper is probably the best thing. If you're concerned about harmful algal blooms in particular, that site is updated pretty regularly, more often than it used to be. And it can be a really good indication of where there might be issues. In terms of some of the other recreation impacts, you know, the Riverkeeper online mapper can show trends, which can be helpful. And there's ways to look at, is this particular site doing well in sunny versus more rainy conditions, right? They have a lot of that data, but it's often up to the individual users to make those decisions on your own, as opposed to some coordinated message. And it's something we're really working with the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance on, along with folks from the Carey Institute. They were able, the Carey Institute this summer was able to do some early monitoring at Sturgeon Pool to find out before the bloom happened that it was about to happen. And we'd love to see more tools like that out there, so there can be some more predictive information for people.
Just realistically, whether it's swimmer or kayaker, going to multiple sites isn't gonna happen. You know, I might go to the site, you know, find out what the tide is and when slack is for a picnic, and you know, I'm not gonna go except 4 or 5 minutes.
I think it points to the growing recreational use of the Hudson and of the tributaries. That really has changed a lot in recent years. You know, there wasn't that kind of demand for it, let's say even 10 years ago. But more and more people are enjoying the benefits of clean water and now wanting to have the information that, you know, should be available. I think, do we have time for one more?
We're gonna do one more question right here.
Hi, yes, my name is Karen Froman, and I'm here with Riverpool and Beacon, and we've been putting kids into the water for over 15 years. We have a lot of experience testing. It's wonderful to be in this room with people who want to continue and engage with this conversation. And I guess I have a question for Jeffrey at Scenic Hudson. You're developing more public access to get people to the shore. And I'm just wondering what the conversation is at Scenic Hudson about getting people actually into swimming in the water. I mean, we know there are some places that are safer than others. We're all aware of that. And I'm just curious what the conversation is at Scenic Hudson.
Our main focus is to get people to the river and on the river, but we have not had any programs to encourage swimming in any of our parks.
All right, and now Manna is going to introduce our next panel. Can we give it up for Swimmable?
Thank you so much. That was really informative. And now I would like to welcome the Fishable panel, starting with our moderator, David Toman, who is the Executive Director of Hudson River Swoop Clearwater. Theo Malarkey, who knows more about Hudson River PCBs than anyone on the planet. And Gina Gallinger, who's the Director of Outreach and Education for the New York State Department of Health. And Steve Stan, the President of Clearwater Board, and retired from the New York State DEC Hudson River Estuary Program. Okay, we're all here. Take it away, David. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. First off, I want to just thank everyone for coming out today and really appreciate your being a part of this symposium. I also want to just acknowledge how lucky we are when you think of everyone that's being represented here and the various groups. The partnership that Clearwater can have and collective effort that we share with so many great organizations throughout the Hudson Valley. I think we're all very lucky to have this team effort to try to figure out how to institute this change that we're all talking about. Another thing I'm going to be, I always think it's helpful to acknowledge the obvious sometimes and not just everybody assume it together. And the one thing that keeps coming to my mind when we're looking at the Clean Water Act 50 years, more than 50 years past its passing, and with these lofty goals for 1985 that were 38 years ago, is the successes that did take place. We're talking about how bad the water was in 1970 versus now. In my opinion, I mean, if we had a debate with a much broader audience, so I'm assuming a lot of us in this room, if not all of us, are very concerned about that therefore it's important to us. But many people's lives are very busy, they're not as knowledgeable, they've not been as much educated, and they're concerned for other things shadow their concern for the greater picture of the water. And those are the people we're trying to reach. But ask ourselves, who at this point in time is not better off because of what has taken place to clean water in 1970? Everybody is. Absolutely everybody. And to me, that's the confidence that the work that we need to do that we're talking about today will only take us to that next step where the future generations will say the same thing 50 years from now if we succeed. That who is at a loss? Nobody. Everybody has benefited from the cleaner water and the effort we're doing. So I just say that it's very obvious to us, but we should share that when we talk with people who this is not their top priority, because it really is just beneficial, and we just need to achieve these steps to get there. So that's my simple take on confidence of where we are and where we're headed to. We're going to discuss with this panel the fishability of water. The Clean Water Act did establish a lofty goal of fishability and of waters by 1983 to achieve a level of water quality that would be suitable for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. Within that, we also have to ask our question, and I'm sure it's going to be addressed as the panel speaks today. Still there? And that's the edibility of fish, and how important is that in the understanding of fishability of water, and realizing that there are people who as fishermen are not doing it purely for recreation, but actually for part of their subsistence. And I think that that's really important. That same year, in 1983, the Hudson River was proposed as a Superfund site as a result of GE's PCB contamination, and then officially listed the following year in 1984. PCB contamination and the continuation of contaminate the tissue of fish in the Hudson River. Many fish populations continue to decline over time, with fisheries closing over the decades, including recreational and commercial shad fishing, which closed in 2010. Though the fishery closures combined with recovery and management plans, such as the New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation's recently released recovery plan for the Hudson River American shad, are glimmers of hope for a more fishable Hudson River. Like with other goals of the Clean Water Act, the goal of fishable waters is a lofty one. We will continue to strive for over the next 50 years. To further explore the Clean Water Act's goals of the fishable Hudson River, I would like to introduce our speakers, and we'll start with Althea Malarkey, PCB's project coordinator at Scenic Hudson.
Hello. Down a little bit. Hi, my name is Althea Malarkey. I worked at Scenic Hudson on staff for many years, and as Amanda referenced, we spent a lot of time in the car talking PCBs. Man, that's some of my best memories of working at Scenic Hudson, was driving up to Fort Edward with you during the active remediation. You've seen the mission before. Jeff and Zavino mentioned what our mission is. I wanted to talk first about the goals. Without goals, there's no accountability. So they're the heart of whatever we're talking about. Lofty goals, to be sure, but goals are really, really important, because without them, we have nothing to strive towards. And I put in here sort of what's written in the Clean Water Act in that legalese language, and I'm not an attorney, though I spend a lot of time with attorneys, unfortunately. No offense to any attorneys in the room. And CERCLA, I put in also what EPA considers like fishable with CERCLA as well. But at the bottom there, you can see where I wrote, in other words, EPA views fishable to mean that not only can fish and shellfish thrive in a water body, but when caught, they can also be safely eaten by humans. And I think that's a really important distinction that we need to talk about, very specifically when we're talking about subsistence fishermen and what our goals should be when we talk about fishable. So PCBs.
I call PCBs the world's most toxic traveler, and at the end of my slideshow, I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. But bottom line is decades, General Electric used in their upriver industrial plants, they used the Hudson River as a dumping ground. And if anyone ever challenges you and say, hey, there were no rules against it, they were wrong. There were rules against it. GE just wanted to make profit at the expense of handling their waste correctly. In fact, in 1936, the Harvard Medical School hosted a seminar on how toxic PCBs were. Two high influential GE executives quit General Electric because they said, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep dumping this waste in. And after 1936, they kept doing it. But because of laws like the Clean Water Act and CERCLA and a combination of other environmental laws, including NEPA, and citizens being granted standing about what happens in their river and in their resources, we got together and we managed to fight back and get General Electric into the courts and then get them responsible for cleaning up their PCB waste. And if anyone knows the names of the people in these pictures, I would really appreciate if you could come and tell me who they are. Because at St. Hudson, we have this picture, but nobody can identify who they are in there.
Just like Carly.
It does look curly, right? That's what I thought too. Okay, so EPA. They selected this cleanup remedy based on one thing. It really is the driver for this, and that was an expedited time frame to meet interim and final targets in fish. Again, we get back to the goals. Why did we do the cleanup in the first place? We wanted to make the fish edible. And I like this picture because it sort of shows you the scope of what we're talking about. It wasn't just an upper 40-mile remediation. That upper Hudson remediation was supposed to help the lower Hudson as well, which is also part of the Superfund site. You can see from Hudson Falls all the way down to the Battery in New York City. That is a Superfund site. We've been living, communities along the Hudson waterfront on both sides of it have been living in a Superfund site for basically 70 years. And when you do 200 miles and you do both sides of the river, this is one of the largest Superfund sites in the country. The only other one that's really comparable in geographic scope is the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So PCBs, I like this because it sort of shows you what happens. PCBs accumulate in the body and in the ecosystem. They transform themselves. They can be inhaled, they can be in liquid form. They also cling to sediment, which is the biggest issue with getting into the fish and into humans and when people eat the fish, it's through the contaminated sediments. When EPA selected the remedy, their thought process was if we remove enough PCB contaminated sediments, that's going to reduce the amount of available PCBs in the ecosystem, into fish, and then into people. Always comes back down what's in the sediment, getting into the fish, and then getting into people. That was what drove the remedy. So you hear a lot about bioaccumulation. You can see this, the tiny fish get eaten by the fish, and they get bigger fish, and then you have the bigger fish, which by the way, about that size is where humans are eating them. And then you get to biomagnification. You get to the smaller animals, the big fish, and who's eating those fish, and then who's eating those animals. That's biomagnification. What I like about this is if you say there's not very many PCBs in the immediate testing in the sediment, that doesn't really matter because they accumulate and they magnify as they go through. So what's necessarily in the sediment does not necessarily reflect what's in the fish or in the animals that eat those fish, including humans. The current vision of the Hudson River, I think we've made a lot of progress. I've seen pictures from the 1970s, and I know how much more access that we have in the river and how much safer it is. A lot of organizations, Fran, your program, all the organizations that are represented here, we busted our butts getting to this point. A lot of hard work has gone in to making the Hudson River even as clean as it is today. But there's one job that we're not responsible for cleaning up, and that is getting the PCBs out of our ecosystem. They don't go away naturally. They have to be removed. They simply disperse and travel throughout the ecosystem, going into the fish, going into the animals, and eventually traveling out into the broader world. When a lot of people think about the Hudson River, this is what they think about. These signs that we have posted everywhere. And in some places, I think it's down in Putnam County, there's 12 different languages. I think DOH, I think you do 12 to 14 languages. Because we're trying to reach communities that have moved into the Hudson River Valley since 1984 that we never thought about. Including in the capital region, there's a population that moved in since 2010. They actually eat certain kinds of fish that are not on these fish consumption advisories. They eat pumpkin seed. So we have to, it's a constant challenge to try to reach people who are eating fish that they should not be eating, especially depending if you're a woman or you're a child, you should not be eating fish in the Hudson River. This one sign down in the corner where it says boating is restricted, that's in the upper Hudson, which is catch and release only for fish. And that sign went up after the community spent $1 million putting in a kayak launch because people wanted to kayak there. And after one of the major storm events, they tested the flood mud that was at the kayak launch, and they realized people should not be walking on that kayak launch with bare feet. So they had to put up these warning signs after that. That's the kind of challenge that we're talking about, that it's constantly, we have to be on guard. And we also, we have to be constantly watching EPA and General Electric as they're doing the cleanup. Are you doing what you said you were going to do? Are you meeting the goals and the targets in the cleanup? So where are we today? Everyone heard that EPA gave General Electric a certificate of completion, and I could talk probably for a couple of hours about how wrong we felt that was at the time. It's not about how much they removed, that was the issue, it's how much they left behind. And they haven't measured that. We've learned that what's in the sediment now is more important than what they removed. It's not a threshold amount, which is what was in the record of decision. We have a third 5-year review of the Hudson River Remedy, which is upcoming. And I urge you to pay attention to Clearwater, Riverkeeper, Scenic Hudson, NRDC, all of these groups who are monitoring this review of it. And when it comes time to do the public comments, submit a public comment. Hold EPA accountable to the goals of being fishable. A floodplain RIFS is underway. And for everyone in this room, General Electric and EPA have turned their attention to the lower Hudson River Valley. But the one thing they have not done is talk to any of you. They haven't asked you who's fishing where, what's going on in the lower Hudson River. General Electric, EPA are making decisions about the cleanup without even discussing it with lower Hudson stakeholders first. And we think this is really short-sighted. There's also a natural resource damage assessment that's underway. And bottom line, this means we're not going to get the Hudson fully remediated, but General Electric is going to be on the hook for giving money for projects to communities and organizations who are doing natural resource projects. So pay close attention when that comes closer to a petition. I'm not going to go through all of these charts because this is it's more like the technical than science, but I've heard a lot today about data. And this is very important when you're paying attention to PCB levels, and the cleanup is how close are you to getting the goals, and science should lead the way. What's actually happening? EPA is counting on a certain amount of reduction in fish toxicity levels to reach the goal. And they had hoped they were going to reach one goal by 2020. They'll be lucky if they reach that goal in the next 68 years. They're 300% greater than what they expected to be at this time. And again, I put these up here so I can tell you that the remedy is on track to fail all of the goals that EPA had set in their record of decision for the Superfund side. And when we talk about fish consumption advisories for humans, we always forget fish don't read fish consumption signs. They don't know that they're not supposed to be eating other fish, which makes them more toxic. So bottom line, the river is going to remain excessively contaminated for decades. And despite the incredible work that DOH does on health warnings, there's many Hudson Valley residents, especially since 2020, subsist on Hudson River fish. Science should always lead the way. And I put this up here because Dan, where's Dan at? Something that you said about the last time when they assessed the danger of something. I put this up here so you can see, one, they've never assessed how dangerous inhaling PCBs are. This is the IRIS, the risk assessment database that EPA uses. The last time that they looked at how carcinogenic PCBs were 1996. They haven't looked at it since then. So over 40 years ago, that's what they're basing how dangerous PCBs are as a 40-year-old understanding of polychlorinated biphenyls, which is crazy. And right next to it, I'm showing you something that was done in 2017, and it was done by the International Agency for Cancer. And they updated PCBs from a probable carcinogenic to a carcinogenic. We have a better understanding now of how dangerous PCBs are, and this group has done this. And I wanted to show you something really important about voices at the table. When they did this evaluation of how carcinogenic is, look who was there. So we had Vincent Cogliano, who worked for EPA at the time. So although EPA hasn't updated it, this guy's informing the rest of the world about how dangerous they are. David Carpenter, University of Albany professor, considered a world-renowned expert on PCBs. And interestingly enough, General Electric was there. Our voices are not at the table, but General Electric's voice is always at the table, which is always very important to consider that if we're not there, the corporations step in. And that's something that we cannot allow to continue to happen. This is almost my final slide. I know I'm running out of time. So when I talked about the toxic traveler, on the left, you have what's a killer whale named Lulu. The scientists were following this pod of whales around for several years, and they could not figure out why this pod was not reproducing. When Lulu washed up on the shores, they did a necropsy on her, and they found that she was one of the most PCB contaminated objects on the face of the planet. And this is off the coast of Scotland. Just very, very, for me, very sad. Right next to it is this tiny little brown songbird that lives in the Hudson Valley. PCBs are making these songbirds sing a different tune, which the only thing about birds is how they attract mates and how they reproduce. So do a little comparison. The songbird's not most important in the ecosystem. It's not one of those species that everyone talks about and looks at. But the idea that PCBs can kill something like a killer whale off the coast of Scotland, and we could be seeing a songbird disappear from the Hudson Valley, to me is very tragic and something that all of us should be aware of. This is a vision for the Hudson River that I would love to see. People swimming, I think that's Stony Point Dam, I think that's the picture I have right there. The fish, the crabs, the marinas, the fishermen out there, birds singing, river otters, eagles, which are returning the turtles. This is what people should think about and strive to think about and look at and be about the Hudson River. And this is Franny Reese, one of the original founders for Scenic Hudson, and I love this quote from her. You have to care enough to take action. That's first and foremost. So I think talking to people and getting them to understand that the Hudson River belongs to them, and it's important for you to have a voice at the table. I think we have that challenge still ahead of us. I think we're doing great strides, but we have more work to do. Science leading the way. Do your research so you don't have to backtrack from position. That is one of our strongest things that we can do when we're talking to polluters, is to know what we're talking about. And we know about harmful algae blooms. We know about PCBs, and we can stand up in a courtroom. We can stand on the banks of the Hudson River, stand up in a newspaper, and we know what we're talking about. And finally, the most important thing, don't give up. We've been fighting the PCB battle for 70 years and probably for another 70 years, but we're not going to give up. And I think we need to put polluters like General Electric on notice that we're paying attention. We're going to be asking the question, and we're going to continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Gina Gallagher next, Director of Outreach and Education for New York State Department of Health Center for the Environmental Health, and will be presenting on PCB fish consumption health advisory.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Closer to my. A little bit closer.
I got it. There you go. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeannie Gallinger, and I am the Director of Outreach for the Department of Health. I'm here as a stand-in. Many of you may know Audrey Van Connecting, who is really the lead on all of the work that we've done on our Hudson River Fish Outreach Program. So I am a deficient pinch hitter for her. And I'm also here with my colleague, Thomas Sweck, who is recently joined us here at the Department of Health. It's kind of interesting because as we talked about the Clean Water Act and the goals of the Clean Water Act, one of the challenges that, we all see, you look out on a beautiful river here, we want to get people out on the river, we would love to see them fishing. We want to make sure that they understand though, that there's risks associated with that behavior when it comes to eating the fish. And that's heartbreaking, right? I mean, that shows the progress that we've made and the barriers that we face, that we still have an entire program here that's built around telling people, making sure people know you can't eat that fish that you catch. So, you know, our program goals are really to make sure that people understand the Hudson River and the advice for the Hudson River when it comes to eating fish. We basically got 192 miles of advice that goes from Hudson Falls to New York City. Above that area, you know, the advice is very straightforward: eat no fish, catch no fish. It gets more complicated as options become available to anglers. And it really takes our community partnerships, like we have with many of the people here, to help us get the word out to people about what fish they should eat, what fish they should toss. So our Hudson River outreach project activities and scope of our program is kind of laid out here. We have partners that we've identified over the years and that have come forward and said they were going to work with us and help us administer an outreach program. Again, that travels that whole 192 miles of river. We work with property owners. We have a pretty active sign program that we're very proud of over the year, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and the sign maintenance program that's associated with that. We do a lot of evaluation work in my office. It's one of the things we really pride ourselves on. We like to evaluate programs before we start them. So the work that we do out on the river talking to people is really the stock feed for what we're doing next and where we're going next in terms of our program building. We try to incorporate a variety of health education methods into our outreach efforts, and this has been particularly exciting with work that we're doing with newcomer populations and the Burmese in the Hudson Valley, as well as in the Great Lakes area. And again, it's very informative, that work, because when you're talking about putting advice out on food, you have to understand your audience. Is it culturally appropriate? Is it actionable? You know, how does somebody know, like, oh, this fish is contaminated? Do I know what this fish is? You know, can I catch this fish? And so if not, how, you know, what do I do if I catch a fish? So I want to just talk a little bit about the program and its scope of work every year. We have a core team in New York State that is supplemented by, I think it's 8 or 9 partners now in the program. We get out about 20 to 40 field days every year. We're at fairs, hunting shows, fishing and boating shows. We go to churches and other faith-based organizations. We work with WIC clinics and food pantries. And we're also we've done some English as a second language, GED classes, and have worked very closely with some of our refugee agencies. Again, we really try to focus in areas where fish is most contaminated and the advice is most complicated. So we really want to make sure we're hitting areas like Newburgh, Poughkeepsie, Peekskill, Croton, but we do have activities that are going from New York City all the way up to the northern part of the Hudson. Our partners have grown over the years. We have given out grants annually for $15,000 since 2009. We started with, I think, 6 partners. We're now, 4 partners. We're now up to 6 active partners. We allocate about $90,000 each year to support these partners. And we really enjoy working with them. As you can see, Audrey's little face poking through the little picture there at one of their meetings. Our 6 partners that are funded are laid out here, and their activities are our activities. They're out tabling, they're presenting in their community venues, they're offering classes at schools. They've come up with puppet shows or things for kids to really, you know, provide advice. And they do their own local media. You know, they do advertising and radio, newspapers, and social media to help us get our messaging out. This is the list of other partners that we've worked with over the years in terms of who we partnered with our overall program, and there's a lot of them. So let me just take a step back and just talk to you about what the advice is for the Hudson River. And we are going through right now and updating all of our signs and language so that they're more gender inclusive. So there's a little flip flop and you're going to see in some of the graphics. But our advice is really premised on being protective of the most vulnerable populations, and that's really kids. So people who can become pregnant, and kids are what we call our sensitive population when we talk about our advice. Our general population is really everybody else. And in those cases where, you know, you can eat the fish, the advice really depends on who you are, where you fish, and what you catch. We're also learning that in some cases, having that divide is probably less important. People are really getting more interested in having whole family advice, because when you bring on the meal, you want to eat the meal with your family. So when you translate this to the Hudson, it's broken up in colors here. At the top is our upper Hudson advice, which is very straightforward. Take no fish, eat no fish, and that extends down to, I believe, Baker's Falls. Our mid-Hudson area is where things get more complicated. Our sensitive populations still don't eat any fish, but there are 4 species available to anglers in that area. Unfortunately, striped bass is not one of them. Striped bass is an incredibly popular fish species. We work very hard to get our messages out to striped bass anglers, and we've worked over the years to develop information with them and for them, which we hope is becoming more effective. On the lower Hudson, again, you see more of a variety of fish species for the general population, but the sensitive population is still restricted down the line, not eating any fish. So the advice for everyone else ranges from, depending on the species, not eating any to eating up to 4 meals a month for species that aren't shown here. And people can also eat blue crabs up to 6 meals a week. 6 crabs a week. Our advice also, in addition to fish advice about what to eat and what to throw away, is we have magnets and information on how to trim and skin your fish, because the outer part of the fish contains the highest levels of PCBs, as well as the cooking fats. And so removing the skin and cooking in a way that fat drips out is the best way to prepare fish. And we, you know, again, that's in addition to telling people to avoid very high PCB fish. This advice is problematic when we talk with newcomer populations who really prepare different fish sometimes than what we have listed, as well as their own cooking methods like making fish paste and so forth. So I just want to show a couple of examples. I think I had a couple of them up of our warning signs that we have up and down that landowners put up on their property. The signs are free to property owners. We don't put up signs because we don't have access to people's property. We have to do this all with the consent and support of landowners. Posting signs are totally voluntary on their part. And we have 500 signs over the years that we've mailed out. And we have 120 active signs and fishing access sites from the Detroit Federal Dam down to New York City. These primarily include state, municipal, public access points like parks and boat launches. But we do take requests. So when we hear from groups like you that signs are sorely needed, we will reach out and see if we can get a partner to get a sign and get it up there. And in its appropriate language. We have an application on our website at the address below where you can actually see our signs, which ones are active versus which ones are not, or where there are signs, where there's no signs. And the whole idea here is to drive progress as well as accountability. We go out annually too and do sign checks, and our partners help us with this as well to make sure that our signs are maintained up and down the river. I'm running low. Okay. This is just to show you pictures of several materials that we have available. They range from coloring books to magnets to cookbooks about how to eat crabs. All of them focus on providing actionable advice, and they're in a variety of languages, and we continue to grow these based on requests. Probably one of the best tools that we are expanding on over the years are our county fishing water maps. These maps are so effective, particularly with audiences who struggle with literacy or think the advice is too complicated. It takes our waters and it says blue waters are good. We can eat 4 meals a month of any fish. Red waters like the Hudson steer clear, and it reflects, by the way, the sensitive population advice. And then there's more complicated green waters where it's like you can eat some fish, but not all fish. And what we found over the years is that people really find it very easy to say, okay, Hudson River, where can I go? Because it stinks when you go to an event and in Newburgh and they say, where can I fish on the Hudson? And you say, well, you can't, but now we can say you can go here. I want to just talk really, really quick about some of the outreach work that we've been doing with newcomer populations and some of the stuff that we've learned. We know from studies done earlier by the Department of Health that there are populations that eat considerably more fish, well beyond our 4 meal a month advice. And we've been doing work in particular with the Burmese populations, both in the Great Lakes area and, as I mentioned before, in the Hudson Valley. They are have been very unaware of contamination issues. They come from cultures where eating fish that you catch is part of their cultural practice. And it's a really challenging thing because we don't want to discourage them from the behavior. And again, they're a subsistence population in many cases, but we want them to make good choices. And so we have been working with them on different material development strategies to help bring our advice to them in an easier format. And these include developing spoken word videos, because we've learned from some of these populations, they may not read in their own language as well as learning their skills in English. And we've worked a lot with partner agencies on this. And I think I mentioned before, we've gone into some of the resettlement agencies and worked on with a variety of events. I just want to blast through really fast if I can. Some of the information we learned from our, we do a fish consumption survey that has been running for many years up and down the Hudson. This isn't a Creole survey. It's not statistically significant. It's basically when we talk to anglers, because we get out right at the piers with them and ask them basic questions. This information is available on our website as well for you guys to take a look at. So just really quickly, and to end here, I mean, health advisories are needed, and getting the word out is probably the biggest challenge right now. It's one tool that we use to make sure that people, make their choices about eating locally caught fish. There are other tools that are in play right now that are also effective, but our advice is not in regulation or a requirement. It's a guideline level that people can choose to follow or not to follow. The Hudson is not alone, although the Hudson is probably our biggest, most restrictive water body. We've got many water bodies that have advice. I just want to say that the biggest strength of our program is our partners. We absolutely could not do this without them, and we are so happy to be able to fund them annually to help us with this work. Thank you very much.
We appreciate that. Next up is Steve Stan, President of the Board of Directors of the Hudson River Clearwater, with a long career with both Department of Environmental Conservation as well as Clearwater. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Gina. And Althea. I should say up front that I'm not a fisheries biologist. I've spent my 4 years on river teaching rather than doing research, but my introduction, as with so many other educators, environmental educators, was going out with my dad fishing in the river and small trout streams in western Massachusetts. And when I came to the Hudson, the fish in the river really became one of my favorite parts of my work. And what I'm gonna try and do is translate for you what I've learned from working with fisheries biologists at the DEC. Great work on the Hudson itself. I don't think I need to, you probably are all familiar with the fact that the river, when it was first visited by indigenous peoples and later on by European settlers, had loads of fish. The first written records we have, I went back and looked at some in a neat repository online and early descriptions of the New Netherlands. Adrian van der Donk, of course, the river is rich in fishes. This one from a short account of the Mohawk Indians by Reverend Johannes Megapolensis Jr. In this river, there's great plenty of all kinds of fish: pike, eels, perch, lampreys, suckers, catfish, sunfish, shad, bass, etc. In the spring and May, the perch are so plenty that one man with a hook and line will catch in 1 hour as many as 10 or 12 can eat. There's also in the river a great plenty of sturgeon, which we Christians do not like, but the Indians eat them greatly. I also don't need to tell you that things got pretty degraded up to the point where the Clean Water Act was passed. This is a picture of the Albany pool. I don't have a date on this. The picture next to it is from a dock that Clearwater used to use, the snow dock in Albany. There was a lot of oil, trash, dead fish. And there are accounts from DEC biologists of doing fish surveys in the Albany pool region and finding virtually no fish. Maybe they saw one, they didn't catch any, but they saw one at the top breathing air, or trying to breathe air. But things have improved thanks to the Clean Water Act and the work that's been done with funding from the Pure Waters Bond Act, from the Clean Water Act, and subsequent legislation. We've gone from the Hudson Mohawk being a septic tank to a place where you can at least think about swimming now in certain conditions. And in fact, there are now a great number of fishes up there. Each year, the Hudson River Estuary Program runs something called the Day of Life in Hudson Harbor, in which about 5,000 students go out and sample the river from the watershed, from the Mohawk, all the way down to New York Harbor, the East River, and the Harlem River. And but in the Corning Preserve, we do fish there, and yes, we do catch fish and a great variety of them. So things have improved, and there's a great abundance of fish out in the river. Even in the worst days of pollution, if you go back and read Bob Boyle's book, Hudson, the Natural and Unnatural History, he describes some of the great pollution of the river, but he also describes great diversity and still abundance of fish life there. One of my favorite places to fish, and to go staying using this net, is the Hudson in Manhattan, in northern Manhattan, near the George Washington Bridge and the Little Red Lighthouse. And if we go fishing there, people look at the water, it's dirty, there's pollution along the shore, tires, trash. We go fishing there, you might catch a winter flounder. You might catch a sea robber. You might catch a seahorse. Now, and obviously some of those fish are not going to be present in fresher water. We've been saying up in Catskills, we might catch pumpkin seeds, which Peter mentioned, or Peter mentioned, very common fish up there. We might catch catfish, or we might catch killifish. All told, there are about 237 species of fish in the river. This is according to Tom Lake, the keeper of the official Hudson River list of species. And of those, there's probably 60 or 70 that are fairly common, and then others that are seasonal or less frequently found. We've heard about the heritage pollutants, so-called heritage pollutants of the river, and about the impacts they've had on fish. And you've seen copies of these signs before. And so far, the presentations today have talked mainly about pollutants. Now, the pollutants matter to fish for sure, but one of the things the Clean Water Act that hasn't been mentioned today that I think deserves mention is the Clean Water Act also protected habitat. It mandated that projects requiring landfilling or discharge of dredged materials obtain a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. A bit of a problem there perhaps, but there was habitat protection included in the Clean Water Act. And there's no better example of that regarding, and one more thing. Language of the act says that no discharge of dredged or filled material shall be permitted, which will cause or contribute to significant degradation of the waters of the United States, including loss of fish and wildlife habitat. And there's no better example of that than, of course, the Westway project, which went on for many years and was really pushed by real estate developers, by municipal officials, by Army Corps officials, actually. In spite of the fact that there was evidence that the deteriorating piers on the west side of Manhattan were a valuable habitat for the heroes of so many Hudson River battles, the striped bass. Now, the battle was eventually won over NEPA considerations, over the inadequacies of the environmental impact statements prepared for the program, but it was driven by that requirement that the permit be obtained and that the EIS be done for that. I can't really, I'm going to go into just a few of the specific species. There are 200 plus species. I can't talk about the status of all of them. Fisheries management issues actually must address a host of parameters not specifically regulated by the Clean Water Act, many of them having to do with how humans interact with fish. It's important to realize that the fish that we consider to be ours, the shad, sturgeon, striped bass, for example, actually travel outside the river. And they're as much North Carolina's fish or Virginia's fish or Maine's fish as they are ours, even though they're born here. Shad, for example, after they leave here in the spring, they head up to the Gulf of Maine. From there, as things clean up in the, or warm up in the, or colder, I'm sorry, in the winter they head south, and then in the spring they come back to where we are here. Now, in the process, they go past a lot of other folks who are interested in catching them. And shad are really the money fish for so many of the commercial fishermen along the river. Wasn't the sturgeon, wasn't the striped bass, it was really the shad. And they're not doing so well these years. It's hard to determine the actual population of shad, but there is a yearly survey that's done of the young that are produced each year. You compare it year after year after doing the same sort of sampling in the same places, same time of year. What does it show us? You see that the shad population collapsed in 2010, and it hasn't come back. The reasons are overfishing, not necessarily just here, but out in the ocean where the shad are caught as they travel up and down the coast. Adult shad and also young ones caught in the herring fisheries. So there's a lot of issues with taking of shad, with overfishing, basically. We could help by restoring habitat along the river, but it's really going to take the shad coming back and avoiding catching them for them to take advantage of that. Striped bass, we talked about striped bass being a really popular fish. Again, the other year surveys on striped bass, up and down. Again, the main problem here is recreational fishing. People catch a lot of striped bass. Some of them don't make it, even if they're released. So, and there's concern about trying to catch trophy fish, the big ones, which are the most fecund females. They produce the most eggs. So these, under guidance from federal cooperative fisheries management, your state is limiting the size that you can catch striped bass, 18 to 28 inches. And they're requiring the use of the kind of hook, circle hook, which minimizes mortality of the fish. Sturgeon, the iconic fish in the river, overfished many times over its history, over our history, most recently in the 1990s. How are they doing? Well, there's an annual survey of the young fish before they go out to the ocean. They were doing fairly well for a while. The last few years have not been so good, but overall, they think they're still hanging in there. They're not really sure why the fish population, why the young year survey has gone down. It could be sampling problems. Could be changes in where the salt content is related to the fish. I'm not going to go into many other species. I can't have time, but One I will mention to point out another issue, this is a fish called Atlantic tom cod. Another name for it is frost fish because it comes up to spawn in the river under the ice in the river, if there is ice on the river. And as you might expect, it's cold water fish with temperatures going up because of global warming, climate change, the fish are in decline. And then another one issue is invasive species. Here's a number of fish found in the river. Of them, which do you think are the natives and the non-natives? Most people, in my experience, will say the carp's non-native. It is, and it was introduced actually here in Newburgh, back around the 1830s. Largemouth bass, a lot of people think is native. It's not. It was introduced because it's very popular game fish. The two catfish, one of them is introduced. Actually, it migrated through the canals, the chute, and is replacing the white catfish, the native one, the lower species. And finally, that fancy looking long jawed fish with the teeth is native to Atlantic fish. About in freshwater, about 33 of the 100 or so fish studied are in fact non-native species. Most recent, the round goby, I think you've all heard about that, and calls out to the need to control migration through the canals of species like this that could be impactful. I'm getting ahead of myself. I do want to point out this in terms of thinking about how we can keep fish populations in good shape going forward. There's a lot of work behind the scenes by DEC, by scientists monitoring the fish in the river. We don't hear much about that. It often is the last thing to be funded. Monitoring water quality, monitoring fish stocks and the like. Particularly important is with the closure of Indian Point. The utilities are no longer required to do fish surveys that formed a great store of data about fish in the river over the years. And we need to find ways to fund that so we can continue and we have that basic data continue and letting us know how the fish are doing in the river. I recommend the Hudson and Delaware Fisheries Unit pages on the New York DEC website if you want to know more about any of the species that I've just discussed. Thanks.
All right, we're going to get us around a little bit and take two quick questions before we go to the break. So we're just going to shift everything back about it.
Good morning. My name is Jeff. My name is Jeff Sisson. I'm the executive director for the Mid-Hudson Discovery Museum. We're located right on the Fallkill and the Hudson, right near the walkway over the Hudson. And I have one question and one offer. The question is, the testing of the waters seems very complicated, takes very long. You could say, why isn't there an app for that? But what is the process for testing and why does it take so long? Because obviously that information would be so helpful to people just at a whim's notice. And then as far as an offer goes, I have a 7,000 square foot pavilion right on the Hudson, right where the Fallkill comes in. There's a lot of fishing that goes on there too. But typically we charge that pavilion for the use of the pavilion, but I'm open to just programming there. Anybody that wants to partner with us to have programming for the children and the families that goes on there. We're right in Warriors Park. We have access to the entire area and we're open to that. So my question about the water testing.
I think that might be directed for some of the water folks, but we're about to go into a break. And so perhaps you can find some of the water panelists, potentially Dan Shapley, if he could raise his hand, so you guys can connect during the break. And then I'm actually going to bring this microphone to Dan Shapley so he can ask his own question.
First of all, thanks, Steve, for mentioning the canal issue, and for those who want to take action to stop invasive species coming through the canal. There's a fact sheet on that table right there that Riverkeeper has, and an action alert on the website right now. I urge you to learn more about it. But I had a question for Gina. Trying to get this mic right. Sorry, online folks. Can you tell us, you've talked about PCBs and their impact. We have PFAS in the fish here in Newburgh that there are advisories for, but the state has, I understand, a lot of data on fish, some amount of data on fish, with PFAS? And when are we going to see advisories adopted that reflect that data?
Great question. So yes, we collect data on fish, actually, BBC collects data on fish throughout the state on a revolving basis. And quite honestly, I don't know what that basis is, but it's oftentimes, sometimes convenience. Sometimes it happens when there are sites that there's special concern about. And that actually prompted some of our earlier PFAS data that's been collected. We continue to, and when we collect our fish data, we run it. We run it also for PFAS. We have advisories on PFAS. Are they sufficient? Have we covered the whole state? Nope, we have not. And it's like with every other contaminant, it's been an ongoing process to really develop that data set as strong as we have for mercury or say PCBs. Primarily from what I understand, and again, I'm an outreach girl, but bear with me. PFAS seems to be the contaminant that is most likely to be in fish that we've known about so far. And I can't tell you what the panel looks like, in terms of what they're testing for, in terms of the series of PFAS. So if that's something that you're interested in, I can certainly, take that back. I hope that answers your question.
All right, everyone, we're going to go to a 10-minute break. So we're just 10 minutes or 5 minutes behind schedule. So we're going to reconvene with our next panel at 11:40 a.m. Please eat the snacks in the back.
Right down in the
I want to come pay my respect. How you doing? Great. Oh gosh, I do. Listen to the team. Eventually, it was tabled and it was, they had posts holding it up. It was us, but I'll remember that so well. I mean, over in New Falls, where they kept it as a pet. So I remember it really well. Yeah. I remember, I actually still talk about that case when my classes. I explained to them. You're allowed to, you're allowed to write side mistakes. Well, it depends on the app. There's certain other cases, but there are a lot of them. You're allowed to. But yeah, we're still talking about the tree I haven't talked about. But
Yeah, boil and read and I say. But that tree was the signature. I didn't say anything. I forgot they brought me along. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh my God, of all the things that I want the commission to. I love the tree, but. Oh, I know. That and your carriage did not like. Fight behind the scenes. But three. Living over the time. It needs. Well, it's
middle of the night, one of these recent nights, putting together a petition, updating the petition for preventing the dance camera fossil fuel plant, fracked gas plant just up the river. At that point, wait a minute, yes, up the river. At that point, we were still waiting on a judgment, and that judgment has come back in the last 48 hours in our favor. So the adjudicatory hearing ended up in a favorable decision that upholds the fact that an expansion at Dance Camera is inconsistent with New York's Climate Act. And the other thing I want to point out is today, April 14th, is 53 years from when Pete and the crew sailed down to the original Earth Day. It was in my slides, but I forgot to mention it. And the fact that it's April 14th and they got there in time for April 22nd and all the wonderful information that they provided that helped get us the Clean Water Act. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Drinkable panel, starting with Aaron Meir, who will be joining us in just a moment. And Aaron is on the board of directors of Clearwater and also executive director of the Adirondack Council. Yes.
Well, just call it, yes, the Will campaign, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Rob Hayes, who I have the pleasure of working with on emerging contaminants. And he is the director of the Clean Water, Director of Clean Water and Environmental Advocates of New York. And Gary Bassett, who is the mayor of the village of Rhinebeck and in chair of the Hudson 7, the 7 communities that take their drinking water from the Hudson, and Jennifer Rollison from the Newburgh Clean Water Project. Newburgh's water, as I mentioned before, is contaminated with PFAS or PFOS. Jennifer grew up here and has experienced what it's like to live in a community where such a serious contaminant got into the drinking water for what I consider to be the failure to use the precautionary principles. So welcome. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to moderate Drinkable.
Thank you, and is this on?
Yep, just didn't want it to be too hot.
Okay, good. Well, everybody, good afternoon, or souls. Yeah, good one. It's an honor to be here and as I say to moderate this panel. I apologize for arriving a tad late. But that said, you know, the worst thing is that you can miss your panel. But it's amazing that 1972 gives us the Clean Water Act, and I was one of the folks that was born and raised in Peekskill, New York, in Hudson Highlands. And my family intergenerationally, because of the size, fishing and subsistence fishing was very exciting. Okay. Excuse me.
You're good, Aaron. Our viewers at home can hear you.
That's, you know, if my voice assumed that, you know, it projects, but yeah. But the point I was making is that for many communities of color, depending upon the Hudson River for food, for drinking water, Peekskill doesn't pull its water from the river. many people of color, my family, in particular, relied upon it for its sustenance. And it wasn't until the Clean Water Act that, as I say, action was taken, but it wasn't until my college years that I learned what I've been imbibing. My family has been imbibing with regards to food from the Hudson, put us at very, very unique risk. It'd be interesting to try to locate families and do a study on families who had significant fish consumption or I guess if they're on the opposite side of the river, Rockland County, those who pull the drinking water from the Hudson, additional tests should be upon them. But anyway, it's an honor to be here. We're glad you've seen the progress. And I can say that the water hasn't killed me, but that's just not the way, again, based upon the science, contaminants within the water, especially with regards to PCBs and other contaminants, operates. The issue is that is your body burden and what your body carries. And so with that, we have this wonderful panel, Brother Bassett, Sister Jennifer, and Brother Rob. And I would just like to at least kick off again to the far right and say hello and
That sounds great. Hello all. And show you up there, Ginger. Okay, great. I think there's another one up here. Yep. You can see that. How does this sound? All right, good. Wonderful. Well, hello all. I'm Rob Hayes. I'm the Director of Clean Water with Environmental Advocates New York. Thanks so much to Clearwater, Jen, Manna for pulling this together and for all the great panelists and panelists before. I get the chance to kick off the drinking water panel by talking about emerging contaminants in drinking water. Before I get into that, I'll give just a little bit about EA and what we do for clean water. We're a statewide nonprofit organization based in Albany that really focuses on state level advocacy to protect public health and further environmental justice. And I think of the Clean Water Program, we're really trying to protect clean water from source to tap, to make sure that when people turn on their taps at home, what comes out is clean and safe to drink. Because of course, there is so much that can go wrong at every point in that process of trying to deliver water from source to tap. And I'm going to talk about one of those threats and one of those risks today, which is emerging contaminants. And I click, let's see, how about that? Yeah. Perfect, right there. All right. I want to start by kind of talking about what are emerging contaminants. This is kind of a slippery term, and I think oftentimes a misleading one. So I think it's important to be really clear about what we're talking about. Emerging contaminants can be lots of different things. They can be industrial chemicals, they can be pharmaceuticals, they can be pesticides, radioactive material. Most emerging contaminants share three key characteristics. First is they're either known or likely to occur in drinking water. For some of these chemicals, there has been some testing. For others, there might be very little testing. But if there hasn't been much testing, they might be likely to occur in drinking water. The second is that they may cause harmful health effects. And here's where I think some of the misconceptions sometimes from emerging contaminants can come in. I think many people hear the term emerging contaminants and they think, well, these are chemicals or pharmaceuticals that we're just learning about, where there isn't much science and we're just starting to realize the risk to human health, which might not be the case. There might be some chemicals where, yeah, the science is really just starting to give us some evidence about human health harms, but there are a lot of emerging contaminants where we have known the health risks for decades of these chemicals. And really the only reason they're still considered an emerging contaminant is because of that last bullet point right there, that they are unregulated. And unregulated means that state and federal agencies do not require drinking water utilities to test for these chemicals or contaminants, and they don't require any action to clean them up from the water. Those are really the key aspects of what emerging contaminants are. And so what kind of causes the problem of emerging contaminants? How can it be that all of these contaminants are getting into our water? Because there are thousands of emerging contaminants out there. Up on the screen is a list of just some of the contaminants that were included on the US EPA's third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, which is limited testing that they do every few years. And so back in 2013 to 2016, systems above 10,000 people had to test for these contaminants.
you've probably never heard of many of these contaminants. Most Americans have never heard of many of these contaminants. I couldn't tell you about many of these contaminants. And yet they're getting into our drinking water, and they could be posing a risk to public health. How can that be? And the reality is that we have a completely backward system of chemical regulation in this country, where industries are allowed to use chemicals in manufacturing. They're allowed to put them into products without first proving that they are safe. And so they're used for decades, and only then might the science catch up. And we learn about the health risks after those chemicals then migrate into our environment, migrate into our drinking water. So that's how we can kind of be in this situation where we are continually having to play catch up with what is being put into our drinking water. Because the fact is that most emerging contaminants are never formally regulated in drinking water. There are a couple of PFAS chemicals up there that we'll talk about in a bit, but all the rest of these chemicals are pretty much unregulated in the state of New York and unregulated nationally. Up until just a couple of weeks ago, EPA hadn't proposed regulating a new chemical in drinking water since I think the 1990s, almost 30 years ago. It's largely because of costs. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Before shifting on to the next slide, there's really two sides of addressing the emerging contaminant issue. One is trying to prevent emerging contaminants from getting into our water. That means overhauling the way we regulate toxic chemicals. It means banning chemicals in products. It means preventing the discharge of them into waterways. But then there's also the side of addressing emerging contaminants that is testing for and remediating the pollution that's already existing and that has been discharged into our waters and dumped there over decades. And that's the part of this problem that I'm going to talk about through the rest of this presentation, because it's where I've been focusing a lot of my energy over the last several years. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on one type of emerging contaminants that are PFAS chemicals, these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that I'm sure are very, very familiar to a lot of people in the audience, but I'll give just a quick background about what they are. PFAS are a family of chemicals. There's over 9,000 PFAS. That number seems to grow every single year. And they're also known as forever chemicals. And they get that moniker because most PFAS that have been studied so far generally share three characteristics. First is that they're persistent, and they can last in the environment for hundreds, if not thousands of years without breaking down. Second is that they're bioaccumulative, and Althea was talking a little earlier about kind of what that bioaccumulation means. Really, they stick around in the human body after you're exposed to them for long periods of time, but that exposure can build up the more that you're drinking or exposed to these chemicals. And finally, they're toxic, and some of them are carcinogenic. The most well-studied PFAS, PFOA, and PFOS have been linked to just a list of harmful health effects that seem to grow every single year: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol levels. And we're seeing these similar health effects apply to more and more PFAS that are being studied. And there's strong evidence that they're applying to them as a class. PFAS kind of came about in the 1950s. They've been used for decades in manufacturing. They're in a large number of consumer products that are being used in firefighting foam and food packaging and clothing and carpets and anything non-stick or flame retardant. They're in a lot of stuff. And one of the problems we deal with PFAS is that right now, in terms of drinking water protection, we can only detect 29 PFAS chemicals in drinking water using EPA-approved methods out of a family of 9,000 PFAS chemicals. So really, what we can even see is just the tip of the iceberg in drinking water. There are additional methods under development to test for more PFAS. They haven't been approved by the EPA yet, and it's really kind of prevented a lot of further action on PFAS from happening. Some of you might recognize the photo on the right, which is the gap filtration here in Newburgh. If you haven't been to the water treatment plant, highly recommend going to see it. It is incredible to walk through these canyons of gap filters that have been installed to remove PFAS from Newburgh's water. This is a quick history of drinking water regulation on PFAS over the last several years. And I won't go through a lot of this because I'm running short on time. But I want to highlight a couple of things. First, action to address PFAS really kicked off from water crises that happened back around 2015, 2016 in Newburgh, in Hoosick Falls, and other places. You'll hear more from Jennifer about what's happened in Newburgh and what's happened since. It really took kind of a scandal and people getting sick before there was the pressure and the need for action to address the issue. And so over the last several years, because of community organizing and advocacy, there has been a lot of action at the state level to start to test for and clean up PFAS in drinking water. And I really want to make the point that all of those actions on the left side of the screen are not possible without the advocacy and community organizing that happens on the right side of that screen. And you'll recognize a lot of familiar faces in those photos. Dan Shapley, Jennifer, her kids are in there, Amanda Joe. I don't know how many press conferences we've held over the last several years, but it's been a lot. Because at every step of this process, we've had to push decision makers to take action to protect public health. Because that's the other thing I want to flag about this slide. Water crises in Newburgh, Hoosick Falls, those were happening around 2015, 2016. It took almost 5 years to establish maximum contaminant levels on just PFOA, PFOS, and 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. Just 3 emerging contaminants. It took almost 5 years for there to be a requirement that every water utility had to test and clean up water if the levels were above a certain level. That can't continue if we're going to address the problem of emerging contaminants when there are thousands of these chemicals getting into our water every single year. But that's progress, and we've had progress since then. It's a bit cut off, but there was a really important announcement from EPA just a couple of weeks ago to finally regulate PFAS in drinking water at the federal level, first new contaminants regulated in decades, and at actually health protective levels. A lot more communities are going to have PFAS removed from their drinking water. A couple of places here in the Hudson Valley that have PFAS below New York standards, but above EPA's: Peekskill, Ossining, Croton-on-Hudson, the town of Warwick. We're actually going to see in this next slide, the Hudson Valley is one of the hotspots of PFAS contamination in New York State, along with Long Island. This is just a map of the water systems that have already exceeded the state's current 10 part per trillion drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS. There are going to be a lot more communities on that map when the lower EPA thresholds at 4 part per trillion are hopefully adopted, and hopefully much more sooner here in New York than at the federal level. Because I can talk just quickly about what some of the next steps are to keep addressing PFAS and emerging contaminants going forward. We're really hoping New York steps up and strengthens the current standards we have on both PFOA and PFOS, and also for other PFAS. Now that the EPA has come out and said there's no safe level of exposure to at least PFOA and PFOS. And we've also, to get back to what I was saying earlier about stopping these chemicals from getting into our water in the first place, stopping the discharge of chemicals from speedies permit holders and POTWs and industrial users. DEC has done a little bit about this, not enough, much more to do. And actually there's a bill in the state legislature to more comprehensively require testing for PFAS and discharges, which excitingly is on the Senate Environmental Conservation Committee agenda next Monday. So some good action there. So I think I'm about out of time. So thanks again for the opportunity to talk, and looking forward to the rest of the panel.
So we'll go from the emerging contaminants of what they are, but also now we want to talk about who's impacted and frontline communities. And so with that, we have Jennifer Lawson of Newburgh Clean Water Project. So Sister Jennifer.
Just stay right there.
Mouse with
Just a little
arrow. Not as smooth as the rest of the panel, so I have my cheat. My notes here. So first off, I want to thank you. I greatly appreciate being here, being able to share how I actually became involved in the Newburgh Clean Water Project. And my thoughts. I'm gonna be all over.
You can take it if you want.
No, that's good. I'm not a rock star. Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to share a little bit about how I became involved with the Newburgh Clean Water Project. Heads up, my 2 daughters are here. The gift of homeschooling, so I might have taken some liberties to pop some photos in there and keep them awake and participating. Let's see how this goes. So to begin, I just want to welcome you to the city of Newburgh. We have a really beautiful city here. We have lots of elements, architecture, historic landmarks, a gorgeous Hudson River, which once the shades come up, you can go admire. But little confession time. My story actually doesn't begin in Newburgh. My family actually, dating back to like the 1930s, had a family owned property homestead in Rock Tavern, which ironically enough, in the 60s and 70s, the state thought it would be a beautiful idea to expand that property. And through eminent domain, excuse me, they gained legal possession of over 8,600 acres of land and displaced my family with approximately 1,500 other people during that time. We lost our home to eminent domain. And in the end, just like urban renewal here, that project really didn't go anywhere. Thankfully, with some people, the formation of Spark, that some of that land has been given back for public use. But so we found ourselves here in Newburgh, and Newburgh has a big history, and it's an industrial city. I'm sure most people are aware of all of the wonderful things that are here, and then there's some others. As I spoke earlier, urban renewal and displacement. There's an aging infrastructure, which we're addressing slowly, but yeah. So, and we are very much an environmental justice community. When we're not fighting lead pipes and PFAS, we've got the PCBs and gas refineries and fracked gas power plants to deal with. So we've got it all. So I grew up, struggled to do the adult thing, started a family. My oldest, Marta, and my other is Nicole. Story began, Marta actually was a month and a half premature. And so that was a little bit of a battle. But over the course of all these exposures and announcements, we had been dealing actually with lead exposure first for both my daughters. Nicole's, who was my youngest, hers was much higher. And so we went through many months, years actually, of monitoring and trying to reduce that. And then when PFAS came around with their announcement, I found that their levels were high. And actually Nicole's was 3 times higher than mine, which kind of was concerning because she's younger. And by then, you would have thought she would have had less exposure to. So back to PFAS. So in the spring of 2016, as new standards were about to come into effect, the alarms were sounded about our drinking water, that it would no longer be considered safe. Officials disclosed that our main drinking source that was over at Washington Lake was contaminated with PFAS. Oops, I hit the wrong button. No, I didn't. Okay. And that they had found at least 12 PFAS chemicals were detected. The drinking water supply was left unusable. And basically our population of 30,000 plus people were poisoned without consent. Little known fact, our lake is outside of our jurisdiction. We're beholden to other municipalities and what they seem, fit for zoning, development, etc. So as you see, there's contaminated soil, streams, fish, wildlife, everything that's been addressed today is there. Just for some info, even though it was noted in the city's annual report back in 2015 as an unregulated contaminant, there was no public alarm about this exposure until over a year later. And on a side note, when you go back and you look at those annual reports, there's this back and forth between reporting in parts per trillion versus parts per billion, conveniently trying to make it appear less of a crisis, I guess you could say. So as investigators were trying to do their thing, it became apparent that it was Stewart Air National Guard base that was responsible for this contamination, for the exposure. And then came the devastating reality which set in for our community, which is that the watershed, which goes through multiple municipalities, the soil, people's homes, their wells, the wildlife, the entire system had been touched by this. Areas of recreation, the values of our homes, our health, and more importantly, our peace of mind were all touched by this crisis. So, and it really had nothing to do with our actions. So that's a little bit, distracting. I have some stats, but I am not a scientist by any means or anything, so, feel free to interpret. I did want to point out that, this is a map of military sites where there's been PFAS that is either suspected or confirmed. So these are communities just within the United States. And it's their dirty deeds that, are, as regulations are changing, as the science is becoming more clear and regulations are coming into effect, that's just going to grow. It's going to be more purple, unfortunately. But that also brings to light that, we are only one community. There are hundreds upon hundreds out there that are facing this dilemma as well. And so it's just kind of crazy to think that, at the same time, you feel quite isolated as a community when you're facing these situations, but then you see a map like this and you go, well, what's that about? We are, as Dan had mentioned earlier, we are as a blessing, hooked up to the Catskill Aqueduct. But again, as regulations change and testing is becoming more prevalent and notifications to communities, is this the fix? Because as more communities want to hook on to these services, it's going to deplete, and it's also going to then put into question who's more important and who's worthy to receive these services. The new gold, so to speak. So as Newburgh, the city struggled to find answers and solutions. A small group of residents set up to form Newburgh Clean Water Project and begin the process to push for remediation and answers. Even though through their outreach, I started popping in, volunteering, and eventually I joined the group. So I'm not a founding member, but I like to tag along and learn and help advocate. So through the use of education, testimony, community building, collaboration, Newburgh Clean Water Project has played a significant role in the city of Newburgh reclaiming their time, space, and the future of our health and well-being. We've learned to advocate at the local and state and national levels. That picture on the right was actually down in Wilmington, North Carolina last summer. I took the whole family down. That was for the National PFAS Conference. And actually the EPA had come down to make their announcement at that point for health advisories that were changing. And then since then, it's even become more stringent. So it tells you how the regulations and the standards and the guidances are changing much more quickly, and the gap from going from like 200 parts per trillion to 70 parts per trillion, and now we're in the quadrillions for testing, which actually isn't fully capable at this time. I think there is an understanding that these chemicals are a risk, and exposure needs to be limited. We like to say non-detect, which is zero, but we need to reduce it. Our community has been given a voice, armed with knowledge and purpose. Friends, neighbors are not just having a seat at the table, but determining the course of action best for our community. And we have a lot of goals, we have a lot of ideas. The main one is we want our watershed to be restored. We want to be able to hook back up to the Washington Lake and drink that water and knowing that it's safe. At this point, we are nowhere near that. Stewart Air National Guard is still just in the investigative part. We have a whole system that's kind of chaotic and doesn't work at times, and is mostly dealing with runoff water and wastewater, but we also are highly involved with the lead pipe replacement. We benefited here in the city with a lot of infrastructure funds, and we are collaborating with the water department and other officials to make sure that it's done in an equitable way and in a very thorough way and such. So yeah. And then the other big thing is that in keeping, holding the Department of Defense accountable, there's the Restoration Advisory Board that's been formed to guarantee quarterly meetings with the DoD, stakeholders, and community members. It's an ongoing, very slow process. It's not fancy in any way to lure people in. There's no free food or anything. But I do encourage anyone who can comprehend anything they're saying to participate and to just log in. We're going to a hybrid format this month, end of this month. So it's easier just to get that attendance up and to have ears open and eyes open to
make sure that they're doing what needs to be done. Lastly, I absolutely want to end with acknowledging and thanking everyone in this room and the many allies and agencies that have supported the Clean Water Project and myself personally throughout this journey. It's been an honor. I don't have everybody's logo, I apologize. But and thank you. So thank you.
Yes, moving reminds me of my daughters who had developed environmental asthma in the wake of a solid waste incinerator, and it often is when our babies that are in crisis in harm's way that, as I say, the resources and, as I say, the response is kind of slow. So, you know, as a father of daughters who were injured, I understand and know that pain and sorrow. And I want to also look at the EJ aspect as well, because Hoosick occurred a little bit before, but the state's response and the fact that they actually had a fiscal settlement in response from a French company that was one of the sources, that disparity of how the state and its resources were going after that private sector entity is not also leveraging its power. As I say, in my point, the easy part of government to government, the intergovernmental side, holding the feds responsible. But anyway, I want to lift that up and acknowledge that. But now we have government and you know, and how, you know, our municipal leaders are, you know, responding, how they, as I said, the state is providing aid and resources and guidance. But anyway, we have Rob Hayes, and I'm not Rob Hayes, Gary Bassett.
All go back up here.
You know, I'm gonna make this a big problem, honorary mayor, but Gary's the mayor of the village of Rhinebeck and chair of the Hudson River Drinking Water Intermunicipal Council. What was it called? Hudson Center.
Hudson Center.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's afternoon, right? Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my government, no, I'm not government. I am the mayor of Village of Rhinebeck, and people will say, well, why are you involved and how did you get involved in this? And it really goes back to an event that really spurred me to get active and become more of an activist into how we can protect the Hudson River as a source of drinking water. So I'd like to thank Clearwater today for putting drinking water on the agenda and as drinking water as it pertains to the Hudson River, because this is a source of drinking water for a lot of people. As I mentioned, there was an event that happened in early 2016, and many of you may know about the barges that were going to be parked on the river. And we had a huge community meeting about this, and everybody was up in arms, and they said, oh my God, we can't, they block our view, you know, they protect, we won't be able to see the other side of the river. And I said, wait a minute, that's our drinking water that you're going to put those barges over, and those barges are going to be parked right over one of our intakes, which is into the Rhinebeck water system. And people, I was amazed that people didn't know where their drinking water came from. How many people here know where their drinking water comes from? I love it, because in the Village of Rhinebeck, we had to educate people to let them know that we were actually using the river as a source of drinking water to bring in and supply, and everybody is connected to. So it became a revelation for a lot of people to now say, wow, we need to take care of the Hudson, we need to take care of the Hudson River. Besides the barges, there was all sorts of things that the mayor was working on with Jeff Evanzino in terms of the gates that were going across and how to protect access from the river, you know, and everything else. But this event of the barges spurred me to now reach out, and I reached out to Riverkeeper. This gentleman has been called out many times before, but Dan Shapley, at this time of year, 2016, we met on the banks of the Hudson River, and we said, with one goal, we had 5 water treatment plants, but none of those water treatment plants knew about the other water treatment plant. None of them were communicating together. And we said, we need to unite the water treatment plants because we need to be joined in. If you have this and we have that, how can we all work together to do that? Hence the formation of the Hudson 7. So the Hudson 7, in light years of time, in terms of a government, within 9 months, we united 7 municipalities
to come together and say, we want to work together to protect the Hudson River as a source of drinking water. Now that's 100,000 people in that area. So I'm talking about not only Rhinebeck, Poughkeepsie, city and town of Poughkeepsie, Hyde Park on this, our side of the river, and on this side of the river, we have Esopus and Lloyd. So those 7 communities all are now gathering and represent 100,000 people. So we formed the intermunicipal council called, hence the Hudson 7. I like to refer to it as the Magnificent 7. Because we've done so much in less than 5 years in terms of moving forward and making the Hudson River known as a source of drinking water. It's important for recreation, as we heard. It's important for fishing, as was discussed today. It's important for everybody that makes use of the Hudson River, but not many communities or municipalities on the Hudson River use it as a source of drinking water, but 100,000 people right here in the Mid-Hudson region do. So with that, that makes us probably one of the sixth largest city in the state of New York, if you want to think about it, that we need to protect water for. I keep forgetting to advance the slides. I love to talk, I'm sorry. I'm gonna go on a little bit. This is slide 2. You just talked about, it's just a recap of what I just said, that this is unique. This is unique that the Hudson 7 is here. And the formation of the Hudson 7 is first of its kind in the area to be able to take this proactive action that we've been doing. And we're not only just focusing on that event, we're focusing on many things. The coal tar that was dumped into the Hudson River by Central Hudson's in the 1960s, and making sure that the remediation of that is cleaned up to protect the Poughkeepsie water treatment plant. We're making sure that Champaign Hudson Power Express, those who have heard TDI is putting a cable down the river to run hydropower electric from Canada down to New York City. But did you know how they're going to do that? They're going to put a trench right in front of your water intake. And when they put that 2-foot wide by 7-foot deep trench and lay that cable, what's that going to do? Cindy Cousin talked about PCBs that are laying in the bottom of the river. Rob talked about PFOAs and everything else that's in the river. The contamination of the river is now going to be stirred up, and that turbidity is all going to come up and be part of what could be sucked into our water intakes and impact what we're doing. And we're also thinking about the future. We're thinking about salt intrusion. Climate change is up here. Climate change is real. I think everybody in this room agrees and accepts it, but we got to realize that salt intrusion is going to be the next major impact to the Hudson River as it goes upstream. All right, so this is the municipalities that were formed, and in literally 9 months is lightning speed by a government to be able to get these municipalities to come together and agree. So I really want to thank all of them. And now we have Dutchess County and Ulster County who have pledged to give us money to help support us, who have also wanted to say, this is so important, they want to join our council. So we're going to remain the name of the Hudson 7, but we're really the Hudson 9, right? But that's okay. We like the vernacular. So 2 years ago, the state announced a program called DWSP2, which is called the Drinking Water Source Protection Program. One of its first of its kind is going to give us a scorecard in terms of how we can manage and handle the watershed area and the contaminants that are coming into the Hudson River. So we need to be proactive and think in advance about what are we going to be doing. You've heard a lot about testing. How are we going to test for PFOAs? How are we going to move ahead in the future to be able to handle these thousands of possible contaminants that are coming at us? The river's evolving and changing, and it's never going to stop. But we who run water treatment plants, we have to be prepared for that and make sure that we have the right program. So DWSP2 was announced as the Hudson 7. We applied for the grant, and we are the first of 7 municipalities to be able to get awarded that grant. And now we're working forward on trying to do that, to identify that portion of the watershed that mostly directly contributes to our drinking water supply, and get technical assistance from that grant, right, from the Department of Health, who is here today, and DEC to help give us that technical guidance. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm not gonna go into too much, but the Hudson River spans a large area, and I think the point I want to make about this slide is that the Hudson River watershed, it really spans 13,400 square miles. We can't manage that, but we can manage our area, which is in the Hudson 7 drinking area, which is 218 square miles. So with the DWSP2 program, what we were focusing on is managing that area and making sure we know where the sources of sediments that are contaminated and discharges from sewage treatment plants and CSOs, where they are coming from and how they are impacting it. And what we have to do from these 5 water treatment plants in the 7 municipalities that get their drinking water, what we have to do to prepare for that in the future. With that, I think there was mention today, Emily talked about the Wallkill. The Wallkill and the Lower Esopus Creek, they are 2 of the largest tributaries that feed our area of the Hudson River. They have a major impact on the drinking water. I can go into stories forever about what happened in the storm of Christmas of 2020, a Christmas storm that caused so much rain up north that the Ashokan Reservoir was flooded, and they released all that into the Esopus Creek, and all that turbidity went into the river. And our water treatment plants aren't made to handle, or can handle some turbidity, but we can't handle that much turbidity, and how we had to unite with everybody to the watershed panels to be able to fight the release of that turbidity coming into the river. And then we have also the Wallkill, which is probably the largest, and it comes from a farming community. And you saw the potential for algae blooms and the phosphates that are coming out, and now a lot of that is coming from, our farms are needed. They need to do what they need to do. And I'm quickly running out of time, so I'm going to jump forward here because I want to talk more about the DWSP2. Well, 20 years ago, there was a program called SWAP. It's now called DWSP2, right? We are now working with the state-supported program to help take that action and create our scorecard. We are really concerned about the land uses that are surrounding our area. We're concerned about sources used for public drinking water, the amount of water that is pumped from public water and supply wells, our water quality, and the potential contaminant sources. As we go into the program, we're now into our 2nd year working on DWSP2 with the assistance of the state and doing that in grading. But I wanted to just show you the area that we are taking under our umbrella to say this area, which includes the Esopus Creek, the Roundout Creek, Wappinger Creek, and Fishable Creek, that all feed into the Hudson River, that are sources of contaminants coming in and could be impacting the river. So it's not just what's there, as we all learned about today. There's a lot in the river. We need to be concerned about what's coming into the river so that we can plan for that. So this is historic. This is the first of its kind where we're going to be able to get a scorecard. This scorecard is going to tell us how to do what we need to do to make sure that you have good drinking water. Somebody said, you know what? Where'd he go? What's in your drinking water? Well, we need, as a water treatment plant, we need to tell you what's in your drinking water. We need to be able to tell you today that that drinking water is safe. We need to be able to design our water treatment plants so they protect us from the contaminants that are emerging, the emerging chemicals that are coming down, so that we can prepare and provide safe drinking water for those 100,000 people. So what do we expect? We're going to prepare maps. We're going to do a lot of work in terms of driving a plan. We're going to inventory the contaminant sources that I talked about. We're going to identify protection and management methods, and hopefully put in a timeline, and then finalize the plan with the results of this program. So what we've done, I'm not going to go through all of these because the list of accomplishments that we're doing that I mentioned before, but with the DWSP2 plan and this first historic event, I hope that we can be the poster child for this for the state. I hope that we can move forward and be a shining example of what can be done to protect your water supply, and we can lead New York State in helping to make this a reality. So with that, I'm going to end. Not going to go through all of this little detail, but if you have questions, please visit us at www.hudson7.org. We have regular monthly meetings on the 3rd Thursday of every month at 5 p.m. there are hybrid meetings you can join online, or please come to the Poughkeepsie Water Treatment Plant and join us there and participate in the discussions that we're working on to move and protect the Hudson River. So my last and final statement is, again, thank you. Get involved. Don't give up, and make sure the Hudson River is protected for everybody and everything.
I think we have time for one question. So someone who has asked one.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentations today. So valuable. Two parts to this. First is, and I think the least important, how do I get my well word tested? Where do I go? You know, that I can rely upon and go do a thorough, complete analysis. And it's interesting to learn that regardless, there's a lot of chemicals that they just don't know how to test for. Secondly, if contaminants are just here and they take thousands of years to go away, what can we do? Or more importantly, what programmatically is available to educate people how to rid themselves, how to, you know, as you were talking about, Rachel, with your daughters, to, you know, get the lead out of their system or contaminants out of their system, nutritionally or otherwise.
As far as well water being tested, I know there are some private companies and, depending on where you are, et cetera, I mean, the DEC is available, I believe, in Department of Health, but, it all depends on your circumstances and what you're actually looking for. You know? And that's also the issue, which is if you're not looking for it, you don't know it's there. And that's been the case for why all of these, chemicals, especially being identified as a class, designated as a class in specific terms for PFAS, are quite difficult to kind of look at. PFOS, PFOS is actually not really utilized now. The remediation, the look, the diving into to address those issues are actually, that past thing. There's Gen X, there's so many other chemicals that are now being produced that no one's really looking at or paying attention to. But as a well owner, you know, I would say these, Rob would probably be the man.
And there's the Department of Health has a program called the Environmental Laboratory Approval Program, which it lists out all the different labs, both in New York and elsewhere, that the department is kind of certified that they have the capabilities to like do accurate testing for contaminants. Some of them might have testing for private well water, maybe not all of them, but that gives you a list that you can start with. Oh, they all do, right?
It's really technical. It's something that we've been trying to work on with Wadsworth for quite some time. And so, you know, there's an invitation for any community to email DEI at health.newyork.gov.
Is there a mic that she can go to? Because I think it's important, and this is definitely for online and listen to folks watching it, so that way we can hear that response.
And I was just saying that the website to find a private well, to find for PFAS testing or any testing for that matter, to find an ELAB certified lab it's cumbersome, it's very technical. And at the state health department, we really like to help people navigate that. So our Bureau of Environmental Exposure Investigation, which partners with DEC really closely on cleanups around the state, we are happy to talk to any private resident and help them locate laboratory services for their area that might be appropriate. We're also happy to talk to them about things that they might be able to do that's cost effective at home to help, you know, filter out some things if they can be filtered through a pitcher or a Brita, because there are some NSF certified water filters as well, although I don't think they're certified down to, you know, the levels that we're talking about here.
And then as a follow-up on a grander scheme, you know, when we're talking about, especially from Newburgh and other communities that are looking for remediation, even if they clean up Stewart, that contamination doesn't just go away. And so one of the big fights that we're having right now within the RAB, the RAB is that our burden shouldn't become someone else's. And so there's a big question mark about, what do you do when you are accumulating all of this waste? We have these filters, carbon activated filters that are collecting the PFAS, and it's being shipped elsewhere to be burned off, incinerated, and it's not a miracle. So that's something that as communities are facing this also have to consider. And then the other part is, well, are you burying it? What are you doing? Where does it go? And so the big answer to all of this is that these chemicals should never be produced. And so there has to be a cultural shift in, it might sound like it's the best new thing, but
Could you spend a moment on the cure part of my question? My
pure part in regards to the body, health
Yes,
wise.
what do you find, I mean, is there any programmatic effort to educate the public on how they can rid themselves of lead or?
Lead's a different entity where there's been a lot of study with conclusions as to how to address it. The beauty of PFAS and all these emerging chemicals and contaminants is that science hasn't concluded yet. There's a lot of money out there for studies. There's some stuff looks obvious, but if there are a lot of studies that are ongoing. We're participating along with Hoosick Falls and 7 other communities around the country right now with a national PFAS health study that's pretty intense. And so we're the guinea pigs who will then create the conclusions that then create the actions and things in that. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah.
This is a good conversation, I think, to have continue at the conclusion of the program. We're gonna have some trees remaining out, but just please give it up for our. Drinkable.
I would like to, I'd like to make one quick statement. This in regard to testing. Because what we found in the Hudson 7 is that there's nobody really managing the river. If you really think about it, the Department of Health says, we care about your drinking water and what comes out of your water treatment plants. DEC says we care about the living pathogens and everything else, but nobody's really, when you go to the State Department in New York State, and you say, we need help in trying to manage and control the contaminants in the Hudson River, there's nobody there, there's nobody answering the door. So we need, as people, to say, we need to include this as part of what's going forward in New York State.
And I think that that's a perfect point to close, but the sentinels that are right now that are looking at the river, they're understaffed, they're underfunded, and they're all, pretty much all volunteers. So Hudson River, Sloop Clearwater, which is a frontline sentinel entity, as I say, not for profit doesn't mean not for free. Now, these organizations are relying right now upon you, the listener, those here in the audience to support these organizations. Sloop Clearwater, Riverkeeper, Scenic Hudson, they right now are sentinels, and they're the ones that are working with community who's sounding the alarm. And I think the closing point is that government is doing stuff, but it's scattered, it's not connected. Websites are inconvenient, but it is the grassroots that are putting on the seminars and the workshops like this to elevate that, and they need your support. And I can't stress that enough. This knowledge is critical. It's expensive, but the point is, these folks are at the front line and they need your support. Thank you.
Thank you to this excellent panel, really rounded off a lot of information and stressed the need for our state agencies to take the leadership. Not that they're not, but there's so much more to be done. So with that, speaking of state agencies and the fact that the global climate crisis is probably the greatest threat to the Hudson River and the watershed and humanity and all of the other critters. To help us understand how we can mitigate and adapt, I would like to welcome Libby Zamantis from the Hudson River Estuary Program Resilience Program, which I've seen this presentation on several occasions and am greatly impressed with the resources that are being made available. So Libby, I think it's. Oh, you're right.
Thank you, Manna. All right. Happy to be here. I grew up in New Paltz on the Wallkill River and I still live there now. And just personally, not speaking for the DEC, there's actually a local water testing group in Marlboro. You can look them up. I forget their name. They've been there for decades and we have our well tested by them. That's not an endorsement. Anyway, I'm here today to talk about the impact of climate risks on water resources and infrastructure, and a little bit about what our program is doing to help support communities. So I represent the Hudson River Estuary Program. We're a non-regulatory part of the DEC. We've been around for about 35 years. I got to work under Fran for about a decade. And we work on all different benefits to the region, but I'm representing the Climate Adaptive Communities team. I do want to mention that we have a clean water team as well that works more directly on like water testing and drinking water. So we can try to get you that information. So many of you are probably aware that weather is kind of what you're wearing today and climate is what you have in your closet. I like this analogy. And in the Hudson Valley, we get all the extremes and, you know, hot, dry, wet, cold, snowstorms, hurricanes. So we have to be really adaptable here and prepared for all different scenarios. Our state does periodic climate projections, models to understand what our future climate will look like. We take the international models and we put in local data to get a better picture for different regions throughout New York State. And based on that, we've identified the major hazards, which are changes to our climate, and those lead to risks to humans. And those are heat waves, short-term drought, and flooding, which all affect water. Our program really got involved in these issues after the big hurricanes of 2011 and 2012. We realized that we wanted to try to help communities work on these long-term issues. So we started funding waterfront flooding task forces. They were really trying to understand our climate vulnerabilities and then create plans with solutions. But, you know, we're now having to move more into heat and drought and, you know, other issues that we're starting to see impact us as well. And those projections that I mentioned, the climate models, are being updated right now, and they're going to be released, the new ones this year. I'm super excited. I shouldn't say excited. I'm eager and nervous to see, you know, are we on track? Are we getting worse, better? You know, what are the sea level rise projections? How are they changing? And this round of assessment is going to have a lot more outreach and engagement material that will hopefully be more useful to stakeholders and communities to understand these climate models and what we can do about them. So the next few slides are the materials really from NYSERDA and that climate impacts assessment. And I'm going to do my best to kind of deliver the information. It's getting more specific on climate impacts to water resources and infrastructure. So for lakes, we're seeing that changes in temperatures affects ice cover and stratification, which can lead to deoxygenation, which is bad for cold water fish and fisheries. And then an increase in you know, what has harmful algal blooms, the settings that they kind of tend to thrive in. For wetlands, there's stress from drought and erosion and eutrophication from extreme storms. And we find that small disconnected wetlands are at the highest risk. For estuaries, increasing precipitation leads to changes to the salinity and acidification, which changes habitat quality and then also where estuary species are actually located. For rivers, increasing rain, heavier rain, increasing extreme storms all lead to damage to riparian vegetation, which is, you know, acts as a protective barrier and helps protect from erosion and helps with water quality, etc. Those events also disrupt aquatic species and raise seasonal water levels. And then in terms of invasive species, tends to, you know, species are moving north. Invasive species often thrive in a warmer climate and can outcompete more native species. Now moving into the impacts to water resources and infrastructure. Drinking water, there's a risk to drinking water wells because higher temperatures lead to evaporative water loss. Also because of things like heavy rainfall, drought, and sea level rise, which affects the Hudson River up to the Troy Dam, there's changes to the salt front, and drought and sea level rise can push it up, and then heavy rainfall can push it down. So it's very difficult to understand, and we're working with USGS to start to model that. Then there's contamination from flooding and heavy rain events. For infrastructure, you can lose pumping and equipment during power outages, and then sometimes backup power is affected by flooding as well. There can be more pipe rupture from flooding, winter heave, soil moving during drought. It has different patterns, and then more dam failures because the probable maximum flood is going to be increasing. And then lastly, increasing contamination from heavy rainfall and runoff, which is more of a burden on the treatment plants. And that kind of leads to, impacts to water affordability. The cost of treatment plants to adapt, to have to, manage more, well, that could be disproportionately felt across communities. And with health, also harmful algal blooms, we learned from Emily that that's a major health concern, as well as an increasing exposure to mold, pathogens, waterborne diseases. Okay, so if you want to get more of those details, they'll all be released this year with the climate impacts assessment. So now moving into some solutions and what our program is doing. We primarily focus on adaptation and resilience, which is really thinking about how can we be resilient to these changes on a personal level, a neighborhood level, business level, community level. It can be a lot more complex than mitigating climate change, where we just have to reduce, not that it's easy, but we know what we have to do. We have to reduce our emissions, whereas adapting is much more complex and needs to be done in different ways and different levels. But we talk about resilience as a way to be prepared for all those different scenarios, all those different extremes. And instead of bouncing back, to bounce forward. Because if we bounce back, as we've learned through the panels today, we didn't always do things very well or equitably. So how can we bounce forward and maybe right some of those wrongs of the past while we're making all of these investments? And nature is really the original, pioneer of adaptability and resilience. So when you start to look at these adaptation solutions, nothing beats nature, because not only do you get, cooling of the planet, protection from flooding and erosion and heat and drought, but you also get a million co-benefits like clean water, clean air, habitat, recreation, all of these wonderful things. So, and the plants, they've already adapted to build back stronger and deeper after being hit by an extreme event. So how can we build our human, physical, and social systems to also be like nature, to use nature and bounce back and bounce forward? This is the Estuary Program's 2050 vision, that all of our communities are thriving, beautiful models for adapting to climate change, especially using natural and equitable solutions. And I'll just give you a few of our programs that help achieve that vision, or at least trying to help achieve that vision. One is our Climate Adaptive Design program. And this is working with designers and Cornell landscape architect students to help waterfront communities at risk to flooding and sea level rise reimagine their waterfront looking out to year 2080. It's actually open right now. We bring it to a different waterfront community every year. So if any of you want to apply or know a waterfront community that want to apply, it's not due till May 15th. You have a whole month. It's a pretty easy application process. But yeah, so the first part is a studio with Cornell landscape architect students. And then now we also have funded a phase 2, which is working with professional designers to get to an implementable project, work through the regulatory permitting, engineering feasibility issues, to engage the community throughout. And we hope that this builds a pipeline of projects for all of the resilience funding that's coming from the state and federal levels. We also support the state's Climate Smart Communities certification program, which is a roadmap of how to become climate smart. And a whole chapter is about adaptation and resilience. We're a hotspot in the Hudson Valley for the Climate Smart Communities program, which is really exciting that there are many leading communities here. And a large majority of the adaptation actions focus on water and were updated just a couple of years ago. So if you're looking for kind of solutions and how they relate to regulation and funding and what tools there are, you can check that out, climatesmart.ny.gov. And we have a program with Cornell Cooperative Extension to help communities every year complete those actions, no cost to the community. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out, climateresiliencepartnership.org. All right, I think my last few slides are about our New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's a nation-leading law to become a carbon-free economy by 2050, with provisions that 35 to 40% minimum investment goes to disadvantaged communities. The criteria for disadvantaged community has just been finalized and the maps are available online. DEC and NYSERDA are the main leaders of this law, but there are many, every agency is involved in some way. It's a lot of it is about mitigation, but there's also a whole chapter about adaptation and resilience, another one on local governments and land use. And it's going to be the focus of a lot of funding and new funding. It also has principles of just transition embedded into the law. And these are some of the just transition principles, which I find helpful to think about. If we're going to do this right and we're going to try to create climate justice and improve upon environmental justice, we need to engage everyone in the planning of our future. And we need to focus more on working with community-based organizations. Consider and preserve local and indigenous cultures and traditions, recognize and repair structural inequalities. And then there's a whole workforce development aspect of this. There's going to be a lot of new climate jobs, green jobs. Who gets them? Are they family sustaining, things like that? And I hope to see a lot of local jobs. And related to that, we do release short videos about the different climate smart actions, and we just a couple weeks ago released our new one on climate justice, and it highlights Yonkers and the groundwork Hudson Valley work there. They looked at historic redlining maps and tree canopy and heat stress, and saw that there were relationships between those. And they're working with the city on how they can employ the youth and get people to kind of correct some of these issues. So it's hopefully inspirational, but it also comes with a new tool from New York State, which is an inclusive engagement primer. It's a short guide on why it's important to engage the whole community, and then practical ways that you can actually do it. So you can apply it to any planning process. You can apply it to any climate action, probably, especially all the resilience ones. So hopefully I kept on time. Please keep in touch with us. We have a newsletter, a climate resilience newsletter that goes out just every other month. And we really try to focus on what will be beneficial to communities, like funding, jobs, new tools and resources. So sign up for that, and thank you for your time.
All right, again, thank you everybody for coming here. Before we get some closing remarks, I'm going to say back in the fall, Manager Green, our Director of Environmental Action, came to me with her thoughts and plans for what has become this symposium. And this is really important to her. And for one reason is after over 22 years of committed service, not only to Clearwater in that position of Director of Environmental Action, but obviously to our partnerships and coalitions and the good work that's been done in the Hudson Valley over those multiple decades. Mana is planning on retirement at the end of May. So if we all get the chance to just give a big hand, thank you and appreciation for all the Mana has done to us.
True champion.
Come around so you can see me. And thank you all. It's been a real honor and privilege to serve in this capacity. I think of Kim and Reggie Harris' song, High Over the Hudson. And Pete and Dr. King, Pete and Toshi and Dr. King, and most recently Thomasina Winslow and so many others that are sailing high over the Hudson are smiling down on us today for the work that we have done and have yet to do. And I also want to stress that this is not a closure, this is ongoing. We've heard about the need to do more to ensure that the goals of the Clean Water Act are implemented and to protect our watershed and especially our drinking water. And I want to say that we will be building a page on the website that will have this information and the slides. But I'm also thinking we probably want to create a listserv that you can use as much or as little. And I expect there'll be other very specific things that need to be done. But let me say, let's all keep in touch because the work is surely ahead of us. I, about a year ago, made this decision because I am so concerned about climate change. The young people here in this room, for our offspring at home, and in my case, for my 5-year-old grandson, who was out collecting in waders at 5 years old, out in the creek in the back, collecting salamanders over the weekend. So I'm hoping that he will join our efforts. So I said that there was another form. Oh, I do want to say specifically that as we move forward, Fran has asked that we also post the link to the State of the Hudson report that the estuary program and so many others participated in. And if you know of other really seminal, important documents, we can put them onto that page. So I said that there was some additional good news other than the fact that it looks like the dance camera program, they're probably going to try another legal challenge, but so far Dance Camera Energy has not succeeded in challenging CLCPA. But the other good news, something that I've been working around the clock, and many people in Clearwater and many others in this room, is that we don't want this compromised river to be further compromised by Holtec's plan to discharge the radioactive water from the fuel pools. It will be treated, but you can't easily take tritium out of, if the water is tritiated, it's going to stay tritiated even through a treatment. And we also know that from the groundwater under Indian Point, there are radioactive isotopes across the river in Haverstraw Bay. There was a pilot desalination plant, and there were isotopes on both sides of the reverse osmosis membrane. And I also just came, thanks to John Cronin, across some research that Dr. Richard Bach did that shows the spread of radioactivity in the Hudson River. So we have a lot of evidence that that action should not occur. It was scheduled, it was announced in February that it was going to, that Holtec was going to discharge 1 million gallons of radioactive water into the Hudson. And there was an outcry. We had already planned before that announcement to bring some education, some experts, nuclear scientists and physicians and others who had the information to the Decommissioning Oversight Board and to the public. So as we brought forward, we, a coalition of organizations that have been working to ensure the safest possible decommissioning of Indian Point. We brought those forward and there was a huge public outcry and a lot of media attention. And as a result, Peter Harcum and Dana Levenberg proposed a bill. And we thought we had between now and August to get it passed. But probably primarily to avoid having to comply, Holtec announced a 30-day notice on March 4th. Am I saying this right? On April 4th, so that on May 4th, the first 45,000 gallons would be discharged. And there was an even larger public outcry. And I want to give credit, and I may be presuming, I probably shouldn't put this on record, but I think that Congressman Mike Lawler has been in communication with Holtec, and so have many other people on the decommissioning oversight. And I think that they talked some sense into them, and they have withdrawn the notice for starting that discharge on May 4th. And that gives us some breathing room to create a science-based collaborative solution that will protect public health and safety. And I think that there's a lot of responsibility in the Decommissioning Oversight Board, but also in the community at large. So we're going to be working on climate change. We're going to be increasingly protecting the Hudson River, especially from new challenges, but also from legacy challenges. We're going to be ensuring environmental justice, which is incorporated in all the new legislation, but especially the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And I failed when I introduced Aaron, I failed to mention that he was one of the founders of the environmental justice movement. We speak about it as if we always had an environmental justice movement, but everything I've learned in terms of how to promote environmental justice, and Clearwater's done a lot of work in this regard. Aaron was my mentor, and I want to acknowledge that. So I probably have a few more other notes in wrapping up, but it's been a long and very valuable and productive morning. And I want to thank everyone who came and everyone who worked on it and everyone who gave us good ideas. And I especially want to thank the 4 major environmental river organizations, Clearwater, Scenic, Hudson Riverkeeper, and the Watershed Alliance, the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, which we incubated back when I started at Clearwater 22 years ago. So with that, thank you all, and to be continued. This is not the end. It's a continuation of work that's already been done and will be done because it's much needed moving forward. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and you can take a few minutes to do the networking. Thank you.